Chapter 23. The Dark Arts. Lily stifled a yawn behind her copy Afdark Forces, a guide to self-defense. The difficult night she had taken its toll. Another sleepless night, Professor Flitwick inquired kindly as the tea he'd prepared filled Lily's cup. You're certainly taking your teaching role seriously. Not that I ever expected anything less, of course. Lily smiled at her former teacher, now a colleague. He assumed she was yawning because she'd stayed up late again marking students' essays. He had no idea she'd actually spent the night in an order meeting. There had been much for the order to discuss. In the aftermath of James destroying the prophecy, they were still struggling to find their bearings and gather the intel needed to act. Lily was secretly grateful that she wasn't allowed to discuss order business with James. She was sure he wouldn't have hidden his glee if he found out that the order was at a complete loss. It was all quite frustrating. When they fought the war all those years ago, it was horrible. They lost friends and colleagues left and right in the fight against Voldemort, but at least they knew where they stood. It was like a chess match, with each side making its moves. Now it was like playing chess blindfolded. They had to make their moves without knowing what their opponent was planning. The only intel they had was the information Severus collected during the Death Eater assemblies, which was very scarce. Voldemort barely gathered his followers these days, and when he called on them, he would call one individual follower at a time. That made it very difficult for Severus to find out what the others were doing. Even so, he made an effort to reach out to the other Death Eaters and strike up conversations with them. From these conversations, he learned that they, too, had very little information about Voldemort's plans and were also very confused by the situation. It seemed that if Voldemort had any plans other than getting his hands on the prophecy, which he still didn't know was destroyed, he chose not to share them with his followers. This worried Lily and many of the other Order members immensely. She glanced at the clock in the staff room and saw that it was 10 to 4. Her first-year defense class, Gryffindor and Ravenclaw, was due to begin in 10 minutes. Lily closed the book, thanked Flitwick for the tea, and left the staff room. The students were already waiting outside the classroom door when she arrived, chattering excitedly among themselves. Lily suppressed a pleased smile as she passed them to unlock the door. The first years had told her, quite unabashedly, that her class was their favorite so far. She suspected it had more to do with the lack of essays. She positioned herself behind the teacher's desk while the students filed into the room and found their seats. Her eyes flicked up from the first-year textbook, almost unconsciously, searching for Emily. She spotted her at the front, flanked by her two new friends. Though they'd only met 2 weeks ago, the three girls had become inseparable. Jenna Winterbottom and Margaret Mohari had both made a good impression on Lily, and she was glad her daughter had found kindred spirits. "Good afternoon," she began as the clock struck 4. The first years fell silent and turned to her attentively. She smiled at their eager, childish faces. "Last lesson, we finished the introductory chapter, now that we've established what dark magic actually is." Hem. Lily paused, looking for the source of the unexpected interruption. The students seemed just as puzzled. "Back here, dear," said a sugary voice, as a short, plump hand raised itself above the students' heads. Lily craned her neck and spotted the visitor immediately. The witch sitting in the back row, swathed in a fluffy pink cardigan with a matching bow perched atop her short hair, was none other than Dolor's Umbridge. "May I help you?" Lily asked with impeccable politeness, though a dreadful sense of foreboding rose in her. Umbridge was supposed to be under investigation. Amelia Bones had assured her during Harry's hearing that she would get to the bottom of her assault on him during the summer. So what was she doing at Hogwarts? "I sent you an owl this morning about my little visit," Umbridge said in a voice that oozed false sweetness. "Perhaps you missed it." "Perhaps," Lily replied with forced civility, waiting to hear the purpose of the visit. "I don't mean to interrupt your lesson," Umbridge said, drawing a small scroll tied with a silk ribbon from her pocket. All you need to know is that under my new position as Hogwarts High Inquisitor, I'll be observing your class today." The scroll floated toward Lily. The students looked at one another in confusion, some shrugging. They didn't know there was no such position as High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, but Lily knew. She unfolded the parchment with a calm expression. Indeed, it bore the signature of the Minister for Magic, appointing Umbridge to her new post and granting her the right to evaluate teachers. Lily handed the scroll back with a smile. She wasn't sure Fudge had the authority to appoint a Hogwarts inspector, but she wasn't going to argue that in front of her students. She'd simply have to endure Umbridge's presence and go straight to Dumbledore after the lesson. "Do carry on, Professor Potter," Umbridge said pleasantly, though Lily didn't miss the veiled sting in her tone. "As I was saying," Lily continued, working to recapture the lesson's momentum, "now that we've learned how to recognize danger, we can begin learning how to—" Hem. "Yes, Madam Umbridge." Lily didn't bother to conceal the strain in her voice. She had known teaching would come with challenges, but she had expected them to come from students, not uninvited, meddling observers. "I was just wondering," Umbridge said in a cloying tone, "whether it's really wise to expose such young children to the very notion of the dark arts. I haven't demonstrated any of the unforgivable curses, if that's what you're worried about," Lily said, silently thinking she was starting to sound like James. "Oh, of course not," Umbridge tittered. "But simply discussing the topic, don't you think it's a bit of a waste of time? It's not as though children will encounter such spells over summer holidays." As she said this, she glanced around at the students and smiled, as though the idea of meeting a dark wizard were positively laughable. If Lily didn't know better, she'd think Umbridge was there for propaganda. Then again, maybe that wasn't so far-fetched. She replied, "The headmaster believes every student ought to learn how to defend themselves against possible threats, especially first years. If you have any concerns, you're welcome to speak to him. May I continue now?" Umbridge didn't reply. She simply scribbled something in her notebook, her expression dissatisfied. Since it was only the second month of term, Lily decided to start with a simple spell, firing green or red sparks from the end of the wand, a useful charm when calling for help. She instructed the students to spread out to avoid accidentally singeing one another, and after a short demonstration, let them practice on their own. As expected from a roomful of first years who'd only arrived at Hogwarts a few weeks earlier, chaos quickly ensued. The class split into two groups, those who couldn't produce even a puff of smoke, and those who unleashed dangerously powerful jets of colorful sparks in every direction. Emily fell into the latter group. Her friend Jenna couldn't manage anything, and Margaret had conjured a few faint green bursts. The standout, however, was Bridget Doyle, who fired off red and green sparks with elegance, earning Ravenclaw 10 house points to the envy of her classmates. Lily, flitting from student to correct wand movements and prevent mishaps, almost forgot about Umbridge entirely. She was busy showing Billy Donovan from Gryffindor how to hold his wand properly, and didn't notice the inspector had left her seat and begun walking among the students, scribbling in her notebook. By the time Lily realized, it was too late. Umbridge had stopped beside Jenna and was speaking with her, Emily and Margaret listening incuriously. Lily left Billy to practice and strode over at once. "I mean, it's only the second week," she heard Jenna say uncertainly, clutching her wand at an awkward upward angle. "But yeah, I feel like I've learned a lot from Professor Potter already. I don't know much about magic. My parents aren't wizards." "I see," Umbridge cut her off, scribbling again. "And what about you, my dears?" she said, turning to Emily and Margaret. "Would you say you feel comfortable with Professor Potter's discussions of the dark arts? Do you feel safe during her lessons?" Emily opened her mouth with a determined look, and Lily knew that if she didn't step in now, a scene might unfold in which Umbridge discovered Emily was her daughter, something Lily would very much prefer not to reveal to the likes of her. "I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, Madam Umbridge," she said before Emily could speak, "and I'd appreciate it if you let the girls return to practicing the spell." "My duty is to ensure that students at Hogwarts feel safe in their learning environment," Umbridge replied. "If you read my letter of authorization carefully—" "I did," Lily said curtly. The students had stopped practicing and were now watching the exchange. "But it doesn't give you the right to disrupt my lesson." Umbridge's protruding eyes narrowed. Lily realized she'd made a mistake. She'd shown weakness. And Umbridge, for all her ridiculous appearance, was not someone you wanted to show weakness to. "If I didn't know better," she said smoothly, "I'd think you were trying to hide something, Professor Potter." She gave a saccharine giggle. The bell rang, mercifully sparing Lily the need to reply. Nobody moved. "By next lesson, I expect everyone to have mastered the spell," she said firmly. "Dismissed." The students hurried to gather their belongings and leave. Emily gave Lily a questioning look from behind Umbridge's back. Lily didn't respond, locking eyes with Umbridge instead, hoping Emily would understand she needed to go. After a moment, Margaret tugged at her sleeve and led her after the others. "Let's chat, Professor Potter," Umbridge said sweetly. "There's nothing to talk about," Lily replied, abandoning all pretense of politeness as the last student left the defense against the dark arts classroom. "I know why you're here. What I don't understand is how you got away with what you did to Harry without punishment." Umbridge made a humming noise, as though Lily had said something boring. "You know, I never had children," she said, brushing down her fluffy cardigan. "I always thought they were vile little creatures. I'm not sure who's worse, them or their parents, who believe all their silly little stories." Lily wanted to tell her that Harry didn't make things up, but stopped herself at the last second. They both knew Umbridge was lying, and yet the other woman clung to her story without a flicker of doubt. Lily needed to remind herself who she was dealing with. This was a woman whose greatest ambition was to purge the wizarding world of hybrids, all while gaining as much power as possible within the ministry. She'd even stoop so low as to alter the memories of a boy to advance her plans. There was no point explaining to her how wrong she was. "I've nothing to say to you," Lily said firmly, turning to gather her things. Umbridge didn't move. "You're treading a fine line," she said, her voice entirely devoid of sweetness. "If I hear so much as a whisper that you're filling these children's heads with lies about dark wizards lurking around every corner, you'll lose a lot more than just your job." Lily turned to her, shocked. "Are you threatening me?" "Think of it as a friendly warning," Umbridge replied, slipping her notebook into the pocket of her cardigan. "The ministry will take the harshest possible measures against witches and wizards who try to spread panic among the public. Good day to you." With those words, she left the classroom. Lily watched her go for a moment, then snapped her bag shut and stormed out. She swept past puzzled students in the corridor, and within minutes was standing before the gargoyle guarding Dumbledore's office. "Fizzing Whizbees," she said tensely. The statue sprang aside, revealing the hidden staircase. She took it 2 steps at a time, even as it moved upwards of its own accord, and knocked briskly on the oak door. "Enter," came Dumbledore's voice from inside. "Professor," Lily began at once, but stopped dead on the threshold, falling silent. Dumbledore was seated behind his desk, looking grave. On one side stood Severus and McGonagall. On the other, by the fireplace, stood none other than the Minister for Magic himself, flanked by an Auror in uniform. "Merlin's beard," Fudge cried, aghast, his face a mixture of panic and fury. "Do you let just anyone barge in here, Dumbledore?" "Lily is our new defense against the dark arts teacher," Dumbledore replied calmly. "As you probably already know, Cornelius." "I know," Fudge snapped, his pudgy face trembling. "I'm the Minister for Magic, in case you've forgotten." "I haven't," Dumbledore said. "I know very well what goes on around here," Fudge added, looking more self-assured. "That's precisely why I appointed a High Inquisitor to Hogwarts. It's high time someone kept a closer eye on what's happening here." He shot Lily a look of clear suspicion. Dumbledore said nothing. McGonagall studied Fudge with barely concealed irritation, and Severus looked as though he were debating whether to try a particularly unpleasant curse on him, but none of them spoke. "You're wasting your time," Lily said to the minister, realizing no one else would speak up. "You're fighting the wrong people." "Oh, really?" Fudge interrupted, his face darkening to an ugly shade of purple. Lily could tell he hadn't forgotten how James had mocked him at Harry's hearing. "You've got some nerve, trying to teach me how to do my job." "Well, someone has to," Lily shot back, her temper flaring. "I don't know about you, Minister, but I still remember what it was like the last time Voldemort was in power." She saw, out of the corner of her eye, Severus gesturing for her to stop talking, but it was already too late. "Don't say his name," Fudge bellowed. His eyes bulged, and his lime-green bowler hat looked on the verge of tearing in his hands. "Don't think I don't know what you're all doing," he raged, casting wild looks at Dumbledore, the teachers, and Lily in turn. "This whole business with the tournament, it was all part of your little scheme, wasn't it, Dumbledore?" "I'm afraid I've no idea what you're talking about, Cornelius," Dumbledore said wearily. "You thought it would be the perfect distraction," Fudge claimed, his eyes now fixed on Lily with something approaching horror. "People would panic, think he who must not be named had returned, and they'd never notice the other dark magic user in their midst." "What?" Lily asked, incredulous. "Yes," Fudge was working himself up. The aura behind him was eyeing Lily with increasing unease. "No one's ever survived the killing curse. Some said the boy had to be an especially powerful dark wizard to withstand you-know-who's attack. But now—" Lily shook her head, too stunned to speak. He couldn't actually believe this, could he? "It was never about the boy, was it? It was you. You defeated you-know-who. Then you faked your death to gain the sympathy of the people, to make them think you and your husband were heroes, and now you want to take his place. Instead of a dark lord, a dark lady. Yes, it all makes sense now." "How dare you?" McGonagall gasped loudly. "That's a lie," Severus said clearly. "You're mistaken, Minister." "And you," Fudge turned on him. "You were a Death Eater yourself. But you're no fool. You saw the Dark Lord wouldn't last and changed sides before it was too late." "These are very serious accusations, Cornelius," Dumbledore said sternly. "I would not make them lightly." "Your threats don't scare me," Fudge snapped, looking entirely unhinged now, his pale face slick with sweat and his eyes popping. "I always knew this day would come. I knew one day you'd tire of running a school and decide you wanted real power. Fine, Aura Hyde, if you please." The Aura, a young, handsome man with sandy hair, stepped in front of the minister, wand in hand. Lily reached for her wand in her robe pocket, ready to defend herself. "Step aside," he said with authority. She moved aside without protest. She was not going to start a duel with an Aura in the headmaster's office. The minister swept past her, his bodyguard close behind. Tightening his cloak around his shoulders, he gave Lily a sideways look before leaving the office. In his eyes were fear and revulsion, and also something else, something that told Lily he didn't actually believe the wild tale he had spun. As the door shut behind them, the dozens of portraits on the walls, which had all feigned sleep until now, burst into speech at once. The noise was deafening. Dumbledore had to shoot fireworks from his wand tip to silence them. "It's outrageous," McGonagall said, as Dumbledore placed his wand back on the desk. "We can't let him spread lies like that, Dumbledore." "I'm not so sure it's entirely absurd," countered the portrait of a former headmaster, one with a pointed black beard and dressed head to toe in slithering colors. He regarded Lily with dark, curious eyes. "We've already discovered that Harry Potter is a Parselmouth. The fact that his mother comes from a line of dark wizards would explain this strange phenomenon." Lily did her best to mask her shock. Harry was a Parselmouth. No one had told her that. Dumbledore replied to the portrait. "In fact, Lily comes from a long line of Muggles. I stand by my explanation. Harry's ability to speak Parseltongue comes from the connection forged between him and Voldemort the night he tried to kill him." The portrait gave a doubtful hum, still eyeing Lily. Suddenly she realized everyone was staring at her. "I don't care what Fudge says," she said, needing to make it clear that she was all right, even if she wasn't sure it was true. "He's wrong. Sooner or later, he'll have to stop running from the truth." Dumbledore gave her a faint smile. "I agree," he said, and somehow that soothed her. "Was there something you wanted to tell me?" Lily had nearly forgotten about Umbridge. She told Dumbledore what had happened during her defense against the dark arts class. "I suspected the minister would try to interfere at Hogwarts," the headmaster said when she'd finished. "As you've seen, he no longer trusts my judgment. Unfortunately, for now, there's little we can do. The ministry does have the power to make inspections of the school and its staff, even if they have never used it before." Lily nodded, suddenly feeling like a student again, and understood the meeting was over. She left Dumbledore's office and made her way to her own, barely aware of where she was going, her head full of thoughts. "Professor Potter," a voice called behind her. She turned to see Severus striding towards her. They were alone in the corridor. The students were all at dinner. "He can't prove anything," he said. "I know," she replied, keeping her composure. Severus nodded sharply, as if the words had run out. What had he expected? That she'd throw herself at him, desperate for comfort. "Is it true Harry's a Parselmouth?" she asked. She had a feeling he wouldn't judge her for not knowing that. Severus nodded. Lily must have looked troubled because he added, "He's used the ability for good." Lily nodded. She didn't doubt that, and yet. "Thank you," she said distractedly, and walked away. The torches in the wall sconces lit up as she walked the corridor to her office. She tried to stay calm, but it was difficult. Her run-in with Umbridge, followed by the minister's accusations, had unsettled her. She stepped into her office, where a cozy fire burned in the hearth. She went to her desk to drop off her bag and noticed a note. "Came by, but you weren't here. Full moon tonight, you know what that means. See you in the morning. Love." A pang struck Lily's chest. She wished she could talk with James about everything that's happened, but she knew how helpful it was for Remus to have his friends around in their animagus forms during the full moon. That was one of the things about James. He always went out of his way to do what was right. So even though she'd been furious with him after he destroyed the prophecy, more furious than ever before, she'd forgiven him in the end. She couldn't hold it against him for trying to protect their son. At least Hetrid, unlike her. She collapsed onto the sofa in front of the fire. Severus was right. Fudge couldn't prove anything, even if he sent Umbridge to spy on her day and night. But he also knew the minister had struck a nerve. Lily had no doubt that was why he'd followed her. Evil little witch, Petunia's words echoed painfully in her mind. She hadn't spoken to Petunia in years, even before she died. She knew she shouldn't place so much weight on something her sister said when they were children, and yet the words had haunted her all through her life. From the moment she discovered she was a witch, Lily had been terrified, repulsed, even by the dark arts. She had sworn off them without a second thought and condemned Severus' curiosity of the topic. She'd been determined to prove to her sister that witches weren't wicked, that she wasn't wicked. The minister's accusation had shaken that belief. What if the portrait was right? What if she was descended from some ancient dark witch and didn't know it? She still had no idea how she'd managed to stop Voldemort from killing Harry that fateful night, or how she and James had survived it. What if she possesses powers she's not aware of, powers she can't control? Familiar guilt welled up inside her and pushed aside her inner turmoil. Petunia had fiercely hated everything magical. Lily could only imagine how she treated a helpless wizard child left in her care. Harry had yet to say a word to her on anything relating to that topic, but she knew. She couldn't escape the certainty that Harry's years in that house hadn't been happy ones. Exhaustion overtook her as she stared into the fire, and before long, her head slumped against the armchair. In the liminal space between waking and sleep, she dreamt of James in his stag form, galloping through the forest alongside a huge black dog and a massive wolf. The image filled her with such peace that she didn't want to wake, even when a knocking sound disturbed her. The sky in the dream began to burn, and fire rained from the sky. "James," she murmured sleepily. "No, it's me," said Harry. Blinking herself awake, Lily brushed hair from her face. Harry stood before her. In his school robes, he looked so much like James at that age that for a moment she thought she was still dreaming. But the eyes that looked at her were her own. She checked the clock and realized she'd only slept a few minutes. "Why aren't you at dinner?" she asked, yawning, and mentioned for him to sit down beside her. "I was," he said, sitting down but still appearing tense. "Emily told me Umbridge was at Hogwarts." "Unfortunately, it's true," Lily said. "She's been appointed High Inquisitor. We will probably read about it in the paper tomorrow." "Since when is there a High Inquisitor at Hogwarts?" Harry asked. "Starting from today, apparently," Lily replied tiredly. "But don't worry, she wouldn't dare try anything against you here." "I'm not worried," Harry said quickly. "But she's supposed to be under investigation. Why was she promoted?" "I've been asking myself the same question," Lily said, thinking of Fudge. "I'll write to Amelia Bones first thing in the morning." Harry looked skeptical, as though he doubted it would make a difference. Lily couldn't blame him for feeling unsafe. "Are you all right?" he asked suddenly. She realized she'd been staring at him. "Yes," she said quickly, pushing aside the image of Harry controlling a massive snake. "Harry, I visited Professor Dumbledore's office today. One of the portraits of the previous headmasters told me, is it true you can speak Parseltownge?" The inquiry obviously made Harry uncomfortable. "Yes, but it's only because of the connection I have to Voldemort," he said quickly, as if he sensed she was accusing him of something. "It's not like I'm some kind of—" He fell silent abruptly, like he thought he said too much. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her heart welling with sympathy and understanding. "The fact that you have this ability doesn't mean anything about you. What matters is who you are, who you choose to be. It doesn't define you." Harry gave her a tense but grateful smile. She added, "It must have been confusing and frightening when you first found out about it. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you then." Harry shook his head and said, predictably, "You don't need to be sorry about anything." She had learned to sense when there was something more he wanted to say, so she patiently waited for him to do so. "I didn't know it was a bad thing at first," he told her. "I knew I could speak to snakes even before I came to Hogwarts. I just assumed it was something wizards could do. I didn't know people would think it makes me evil or something like that." She rubbed his arm comfortingly. "Not that it matters anymore anyway. Everybody already forgot about it," he concluded awkwardly. "It's lights out soon. I should go." "Wait, Harry," Lily said as he reached for the door. He turned to her, questioning. He was so handsome, so grown up. She finally understood what people meant when they said children grow up fast. She rose from her chair and went to him, torn between staying silent and saying what needed to be said. But this was something she had to do. She was his mother. "I know you're not comfortable talking about it," she said, a phantom pain twisting in her gut. "But I know Petunia, and I have a feeling I know what it was like growing up with her." Harry looked down, and suddenly the distance between them felt immeasurable. "I really don't want to talk about it." "That's all right," Lily said immediately. "You don't have to, but—" She hesitated, unsure whether to tell him about the conversation in Dumbledore's office, whether to admit she knew the dark secret of his forbidden gift. In the end, she only said, "I want you to know, no matter what she said to you, that you're not evil. You're good. You're good." She stopped, tears prickling at her eyes. She hadn't expected it to make her so emotional. Harry just nodded, still not looking at her. But she knew, without a doubt, that it was something he needed to hear. It both comforted and saddened her. She hugged him tightly and let him go. "Thanks, Mum," he said quietly. At those words, Lily felt a surge of strength. No one, not even the Minister for Magic of the Dark Lord, would lay a finger on her son while she had anything to say about it. Chapter 24. A Glimpse of the Truth. At the second week of term, Harry began to think that maybe this year wouldn't be as dreadful as he'd feared. After the first evening at Hogwarts, which ended rather miserably following the revelation that Seamus thought he was a fame-crazed lair, things started to get better. True, people still stared at him from time to time, but it seemed that their interest waned quickly when nothing controversial happened around him, so far. When he found out that Umbridge had been appointed Hogwarts High Inquisitor, his first instinct was to spiral into worry and anger. The woman who had tried to forcefully alter his memories over the summer, to make him recant his testimony about Voldemort's return now, had a free hand to roam Hogwarts and question teachers and students. But soon after his talk with his mother that day, he came to the understanding that he really had nothing to worry about. He wasn't used to it, but he had a mum and a dad who were looking out for him now. Umbridge couldn't touch him. For now, the routine of lessons and the usual gossip had overtaken any fascination with him, and he was free to be a normal teenager, save for the strange, recurring dreams that plagued him at night and the prickling pains in his scar. One possible reason for this quick loss of interest was the fact that his mum was the new defense against the dark arts teacher. During the first week of term, gossip in the common room veered between praise for Professor Potter's practical and challenging teaching style and wild stories and theories about her past. One evening, while laboring over particularly difficult transfiguration homework, it was only the first week, but none of the teachers intended to let them forget it was their owl year. Harry overheard a few third years whispering that Professor Potter was a master of necromancy, a dark art capable of raising the dead, and that this was how she had saved her family from you-know-who all those years ago. At first, Harry felt a rush of anger at the idea of people spreading lies about his mother, but after a few moments, he began to find it vaguely amusing. Those boys didn't know his mum, they didn't even know him, and it didn't matter how ridiculous their stories were, because Harry knew the truth. Nothing, not even stories of dark magic, that could bring back the dead, could take away the happiness he felt in knowing that his mother was alive and here with him, at Hogwarts. Judging by the first week, it looked as though this really might turn out to be a good year. Ron and Hermione were by his side, his scar only barely hurt. He got to see his mum every day, and the Quidditch season was about to begin. Even Snape was treating him with slightly less revulsion than usual. In their second lesson that week, Snape had given him a passing mark on his Euphoria elixir, which wasn't actually that bad, without adding a single scathing remark. He must feel guilty about what he did, Hermione said at the end of the lesson, as she, Harry, and Ron walked out of the dungeons. You know, with your parents. Do I need to remind you who we're talking about? Said Ron. It's Snape. If he felt any shred of guilt, he wouldn't have treated Harry like dirt for 4 years. He probably just doesn't want to lay into Harry too much while his mum's around. Yeah, I'm not just some poor orphan he can do whatever he likes to anymore, Harry agreed. He hadn't forgotten the look on Snape's face that night in Grimmauld Place when Harry had tried to confront him. There had been no regret or sympathy in his eyes, only disgust and maybe fear. Yes, maybe Snape had reason to be afraid. Sometimes, Harry liked to imagine what his dad would do if he told him how Snape had treated him for the past 4 years. But talking to his dad was a complicated matter in itself, and he didn't want to pile up any more worries on his parents. And Harry had better things to think about. Angelina, who had been chosen as Gryffindor's new Quidditch captain, had scheduled tryouts for the first Friday of term, and Harry couldn't wait to get back on his broom and play. Lately, he had too many thoughts spinning around in his head, crashing into each other and making it hard to concentrate, and he hoped that flying would help sort them out. That Friday afternoon, he put on his Gryffindor Quidditch robes with a swell of optimism. The tryouts couldn't have come at a better time for him. All week long, Hermione had been acting as though their owls were taking place next month rather than in 8 months' time, and had already begun nagging him and Ron whenever she thought they were neglecting their homework. He was grateful for the excuse to escape her watchful gaze. He was about to make a quick trip to the bathroom before heading out to the pitch, but to his surprise, the door was locked. He hadn't realized someone was in there. He knocked, but got no answer. He knocked harder. "Hey, come on, hurry up, will you?" he called, for some reason convinced it was Seamus inside, determined to make him late for tryouts and incur Angelina's wrath. To his great surprise, the door opened to reveal a very pale Ron. "You all right?" Harry asked. Ron looked like he was about to throw up slugs like that time in second year. Ron nodded, but everything about him screamed that he wasn't. Only then did Harry notice he was holding his new broom. Now that he thought about it, Ron had been acting a bit off the past few days. "I was thinking," Ron began. "I mean, it's stupid, but I thought maybe I could try out, for keeper." "That's brilliant," Harry said honestly. The idea of going to practice and smashing Slytherin with his best mate by his side struck him as a stroke of genius. "We'll be on the team together. That'd be great, yeah." For some reason, Harry's enthusiasm only made Ron look more nervous. He supposed that made sense. "Well, come on then," he said, realizing Ron might need a bit of a push. Ron nodded and walked towards the door with the look of someone heading for the gallows. In the common room, they ran into Hermione, who was hunched over a scroll that trailed onto the floor, a thick arithmancy tome open in front of her. "There you are," she said to Ron. "We need to start on Snape's essay. Don't forget we've got Perfect's duties tonight too." "He can't today. He's trying out for the team," Harry answered for his friend, who looked as though he might rather write the essay than face the tryouts. "Really?" said Hermione. Seeing the anxiety written across Ron's face, she quickly added, "Well, good for you." With that, she began gathering up her things. "What are you doing?" Ron asked, voice slightly too high. "I'm coming with you," she replied breezily. "I want to see you try out." Harry didn't think it was possible, but Ron's face managed to turn both red and green at once. Hermione jumped to her feet, ready to leave. Harry placed a hand on Ron's shoulder, half emotional support, half physical, and looked around the common room one last time before they climbed out through the portrait hole. He felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment when he didn't spot the face he'd been hoping to see. The afternoon was warm and clear, with open blue skies. Students lounged or played on the grounds and by the lake, enjoying the last warm days before the chill of a northern autumn. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked down towards the Quidditch pitch. Ron's nervousness was especially pronounced, which might have been why Hermione launched into a lengthy description of her study schedule for the coming month. They reached the pitch, and Hermione left them to find a seat in the stands, where scattered groups of Gryffindor students were already gathered to watch their friends try out. Harry spotted Emily and her two new friends in the front row, chatting animatedly. He started walking towards the team members huddled at the center of the pitch when he realized Ron wasn't following him. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," Ron muttered, eyeing the red and gold-clad team. Fred cracked a joke, and the three chasers burst out laughing. Harry thought he was beginning to understand the problem. "Listen, you can't let them get to you," he said to Ron. He knew he wasn't exactly an expert on sibling dynamics. He still wasn't sure how to act around Emily, but he did know that if Ron let the twins shake his confidence, he wouldn't stand a chance. At least that was the lesson he had learned from growing up with Dudley. "You do want to be on the team, right?" he asked, seeing that Ron still looked downcast. Ron nodded quickly. "Then go try out. If you ask me, you've got a pretty decent shot." The encouraging comment wasn't exactly brilliant, but it seemed to have an effect. Ron took a deep breath and marched stiffly onto the pitch. "What's this?" George called cheerfully the moment he saw Ron with a broom. Ron, ears and neck blazing red, went to stand with the other students trying out for the team. The sight was a bit comical. He was at least a head taller than all of them. "Don't tell me he thinks he can be keeper," Fred said to Harry, as Ron was out of earshot. I actually think he's got a decent chance, Harry said loyally, even though he wasn't completely sure how good Ron really was. He usually plays keeper over the holidays, doesn't he? And he's massive. He blocks an entire hoop just standing there. Soon, Harry was glad to see that his faith in Ron hadn't been misplaced. He managed to save 3 shots out of 5, while the other, younger candidates barely managed 1 or 2. By the end of the session, it was clear who the frontrunner was. I won't lie, Angelina told Harry, signaling that the final contestant, a giggly second year, hadn't made a single save. I know he's your mate, but he's not the best keeper we could have hoped for. He's got a lot of work to do. So he's on the team? Harry asked, knowing that more than any Quidditch advice, Ron needed a win. Angelina sighed, as though already regretting it. Yes, I suppose he is. Harry caught Ron's eye and gave him 2 thumbs up. Ron looked as though he might faint with relief. Looks like you've got it in you after all, Fred said, as Angelina informed the others that Ron had earned the spot. Yeah, Ron replied in a tone that made it clear he was just as surprised as his brother. You'll need a uniform. Let's see if Wood's old kit fits you, Katie said kindly. Ron gave Harry an excited but anxious smile and followed her off to the changing rooms. All right, Angelina said to the rest of the team after they'd left, her tone growing serious. Our first match is in the middle of next month, against Slytherin. They haven't picked their team yet, but we need to be ready for a strong one. Their captain this year is Montague, and he won't go easy on us. Let's take to the air and see where everyone stands. Harry didn't need to be asked twice. He swung his leg over his firebolt and soared into the sky, doing a quick warm-up lap around the pitch, the warm evening breeze whistling in his ears. Releasing the snitch, Angelina shouted from below. He gave her a signal that he was ready. A second later, a golden flash darted off. Harry launched after it, his firebolt streaking through the air like an arrow. One of the things he loved most about being Seeker was how everything else vanished the moment he went after the snitch. Sounds and thoughts faded away, leaving him fully in the moment. In that clarity, when all he could see was the golden sphere and all he could hear was the wind, he felt like he could see the world properly, as if he could predict what would happen next without even trying. There were no desires, no doubts, no fears weighing him down. He chased the snitch tirelessly, the setting sun glinting off the golden ball. It zigzagged through the air, as if not only trying to escape him, but enjoying the game just as much. Harry veered left, anticipating another sharp turn, then flew backwards as the snitch zipped towards him, and caught it in an outstretched hand. Scattered applause broke him out of his bright, dreamlike state. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Emily and her friends clapping enthusiastically. Hermione, seated a few spots down with a book in her lap, was also clapping politely. A few rows above, several fourth-year girls were chatting among themselves. Among them was Ginny, her fiery hair tied in a high ponytail. The girls didn't seem terribly interested in Harry's impressive catch, but Ginny seemed to be. She wasn't clapping, but the look on her face told him she was impressed. Next to her sat a Ravenclaw boy from Harry's year, his arm draped around her shoulders, gazing off in boredom. For some reason, a sharp, unpleasant pang hit Harry's stomach. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to punch that boy in the face. But Ginny didn't seem to be paying the boy much attention, not right now, at least. Her focus was entirely on Harry. It felt incredible. A sharp whistle rang in his ears, just before a jolt of pain shot through his right shoulder. Flashes of red and black burst in his vision, and only instinct made him grab his broom with his left hand before he tumbled. Moments later, Angelina and George were at his side, helping him land safely on the grass. Have you gone completely mad? He heard Angelina shouting through the haze of pain. Why in Merlin's name are you aiming a bludger at him? I had to practice on someone, didn't I? Fred's defensive voice answered. I thought he'd dodge. He always dodges. I'm fine, Harry croaked, though pain was radiating down his entire right side. He needs to go to the hospital wing, Alicia said from somewhere behind him. Madame Pomfrey will fix him up in no time. Fine, said Angelina furiously, as George supported the dazed Harry and helped him towards the castle. But if we don't have a seeker for the match, it's your fault, Weasley. And you, she turned on Harry sharply. Why didn't you dodge? You must have seen that bludger coming. I dunno, Harry mumbled, though he knew perfectly well why it had happened. Guess I wasn't paying attention. Angelina kept ranting at both Harry and Fred, and George too, even though he hadn't done anything, all the way to the hospital wing, and even while Madame Pomfrey treated Harry's shoulder, until the matron lost her temper and ordered the rest of the team to wait outside. By the time she finished treating him and allowed visitors back in, Angelina had calmed down somewhat. When Madame Pomfrey told her Harry was expected to make a full recovery in a few days and would be able to play next month, she looked slightly sheepish. Ron and Hermione arrived shortly afterward, Ron wearing Wood's old team robes, which clashed violently with his hair. It was getting crowded around Harry's bed, so the team members wished him a speedy recovery and left. Only then did Harry realize that both Emily and Ginny had also come to check on him. He felt a rush of warmth hit his face and pretended to adjust the sling supporting his injured arm. Now, after gulping down the pain-relieving potion Madame Pomfrey had given him, he began to realize how idiotic he must have looked on the pitch, taking a hit like some amateur. I think that's a new record, Ron said, collapsing onto the edge of the bed. A weight seemed to have been lifted from his shoulders now the tryouts were over. Less than a week into term, and you're already in the hospital wing. Usually, Harry would have had a snappy comeback, or at least a decent retort. But now, he couldn't manage anything other than a nervous chuckle. What was going on with him? Why couldn't he act normal around Ginny? It had all started that day in Diagon Alley, when they were together under the invisibility cloak. He'd shared the cloak with Ron and Hermione before, but somehow it had felt different this time. He didn't know why, but as the summer wore on, being near Ginny made him feel the same way he used to feel around Cho, as if 1,000 butterflies were fluttering in his stomach. But that didn't make sense. This was Ginny, Ron's sister. Besides, he was supposed to be into Cho. He knew he didn't stand a chance with her, but still. But when he and Ginny were under the cloak together, he remembered that at the start of the summer, when the Dementors attacked him, she was the one he had imagined crying over his fate, not Cho. He kept telling himself not to read too much into it. He and Ginny had grown close over the summer. It was only natural to feel more connected to her. Even reasonable that he'd feel protective seeing her hugging some boy that surely had nefarious intentions towards her. He was only half listening as Ron dramatically recounted his tryout to a captivated Emily. Hermione was listening too, with a half-smile, but Ginny looked bored. Harry thought she liked Quidditch, but she currently seemed more interested in examining some frizzy ends of her ginger hair than listening to Ron's on-pitch exploits. He felt a strong urge to say something to her, anything at all, as though he sensed a rare opportunity slipping by. But before he could think of anything, the hospital wing door opened and brisk footsteps sounded behind the curtain surrounding his bed. For a moment, he thought it might be Professor McGonagall, coming to scold him for jeopardizing the team's chances so early in the year. But instead, his mother's worried face appeared around the curtain. She let out a faint sigh of relief upon seeing that his injuries weren't severe. Harry realized he hadn't even thought about anyone needing to inform her what had happened. He still wasn't used to having someone other than Ron or Hermione worrying about him at Hogwarts. What happened? She asked wearily, as if she were already used to him getting into accidents. Bludger, Harry replied, a bit embarrassed. Madame Pomfrey says I'll be fine. I don't even have to stay overnight. His mum sighed again, settling gracefully into the last available chair. That game is a public hazard. When we were at Hogwarts, your dad was in and out of the hospital wing all year. Harry gave her a shy smile, exchanging glances with Ron and Hermione. If she knew the kinds of things that had landed him in the hospital wing before, she'd have called the game a lot worse than a public hazard. "Why are you still at Hogwarts, Professor? Classes ended hours ago," Hermione asked, changing the subject. "We have a staff meeting soon," Harry's mum told them. "Many of the teachers aren't satisfied with Umbridge interrupting their lessons and questioning their abilities." "Does it also bother them that she attacked a student over the summer?" Ginny asked, with a touch of cynicism. "They don't know about it, and unfortunately I can't tell them," Lily replied, glancing at Harry with worry. "I just got a response from Amelia Bones from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She warned James and me that we could get into serious trouble with the Ministry if I make accusations about Umbridge without solid evidence." "Like defamation?" Hermione asked with some shock. "But it's exactly what the Daily Prophet has been doing to Harry since last year." "That's how the Ministry operates, Hermione," Ron told her heatedly. "It's the same with my dad. They go on about how important it is not to mess around with Muggles, but they won't give him any resources to do it. They barely give him a decent salary." "It's always a double standard with them," Ginny agreed. "It is incredibly unfair," Lily agreed, eyeing Harry. "But Mrs. Bones promised she isn't going to stop the investigation into Umbridge, even though Fudge is attempting to dismiss it." "I won't be holding my breath," Harry said, "but thanks anyway, Mum." Over the next few days, Harry had to walk around with his arm bandaged and supported by a strip of cloth tied around his neck. Somehow, the rumor about the embarrassing mishap with the bludger spread quickly, and by the very next morning Malfoy was already mimicking him getting hit and falling over, to the laughter of his mates at the Slytherin table. "Don't pay attention to him," Hermione said, as they made their way to the Gryffindor table. "I'm not," Harry replied. It was true. He was too busy watching Cho, who had just stood up from the Ravenclaw table, surrounded by her chattering friends. She had cut her hair over the summer, and now the sleek black strands were short, framing her face with a somber outline that made her look older than her years. She wasn't partaking in her friend's conversation, looking distant and distracted. Harry knew exactly how she felt. She noticed him looking and gave him a small, sad smile and a slight wave. Harry tried to wave back with his injured arm, then corrected himself awkwardly. Only once he reached the Gryffindor table, and Cho had already left the hall, did he realize his stomach hadn't turned over at the sight of her. For the first time, he started to think that perhaps she wasn't all that different from him. She, too, had suffered a terrible loss at the end of the previous year, and she hadn't gone back to being who she was before either. Once the week began properly, along with lessons, Harry realized there was one great advantage to his injury. He couldn't write, so he was given permission to hand in his homework late until Madame Pomfrey declared his arm fully healed. In the meantime, he took a small, perhaps slightly wicked pleasure in having a legitimate excuse not to take notes in class, and in the fact that Hermione would have veto lend him hers, which she'd been guarding jealously ever since the Owl's year began. In defense against the dark arts, they were practicing shield charms. Harry couldn't take part, but he didn't mind, since he'd already mastered the spell well after learning it last year. He sat in a chair by the wall, watching his classmates practice, while his mum moved among them, correcting their wand grips or stances, offering tips for improvement. The day was bright, and the afternoon sun streamed into the classroom in golden shafts. Amid the flurry of exchanged jinxes and the shouts of Protego echoing through the room, Harry felt a moment of profound peace, almost as if he were back on his broomstick. A strong, clear feeling filled him. Everything was going to be all right. He got up and looked out of a nearby window. Out of habit, his eyes sought out Hagrid's hut, but the curtains were still drawn and no smoke rose from the chimney. Hagrid hadn't returned yet, but somehow Harry knew he was fine and that he'd be back. As he took in the beauty of the lake and forest stretching from horizon to horizon, a sharp pain stabbed at his scar. He gasped and clutched his forehead, pulled out of his near dreamlike calm. The pain remained, steady and throbbing, and he felt something stir and swell in his chest, as if the pain were gathering force, waiting to burst. Without saying a word to anyone, he left the classroom quickly, barely knowing what he was doing. He was in the corridor. He had just enough time to register how blinding the daylight was before the pain exploded in his head like a small star going supernova. Afterwards, he realized he must have fainted because he was no longer at Hogwarts. He was somewhere else entirely. For a few blessed seconds, the pain almost vanished, but in its place was something else, burning, unrelenting fury. He didn't try to resist the rage. The feeling was almost welcome compared to the agony. But then he felt someone shaking him, and the sensation melted away. He realized he was lying on the cold floor of the corridor, his scar throbbing dully, his bandaged arm aching badly. He vaguely registered Ron and his mum leaning over him. She brushed hair off his forehead, and he noticed his skin was damp with sweat. He tried to sit up. He hadn't even realized he'd fallen, but she gently pushed him back down. "It's all right," she said in a very soothing voice. "What are you feeling?" He couldn't put into words what was happening inside him, so he blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "He's angry." "Who?" Ron asked. Now that the pain had faded and Harry could focus, he saw that Ron looked quite pale. Harry knew the answer in his heart, clearly and certainly, as though the emotion were his own. "Voldemort. He's furious. There was something he wanted, and someone took it from him." "How do you know that?" Ron asked, looking shaken. "Let's get you to the hospital wing," his mum said, a little too sharply. She didn't react to Harry's words about Voldemort. "I'm not making it up," Harry told her, beginning to come back to himself and grasp what had just happened. "I know, sweetheart," she replied, but for some reason looked troubled and slightly on edge. "Ron, help me." "That thing Dad took from the ministry," Harry burst out, a sharp, clear understanding filling him. "It was something Voldemort wanted. That's why he destroyed it. And now Voldemort knows, and he's furious." "How do you know about that?" she said, almost accusingly. For the first time since their reunion that summer, she spoke to him without a trace of gentleness or affection. Harry didn't know what to say. Had he managed to anger her? "It doesn't matter now," she said suddenly, her earlier sternness fading and a bit of her usual softness returning to her voice. "We can talk about it later. For now, you need to get to the hospital wing." So Harry found himself back in the hospital wing for the second time in 3 days. Now that the pain in his scar had passed, and Voldemort's rage felt distant and faint, like a storm that had already moved on, he felt bitter knowing Malfoy was probably going to make a joke out of him again. When Ron and Hermione came to visit after lessons, they found him in a foul mood. Madame Pomfrey had said he'd need to spend the night there, and the thought that something was going on somewhere outside of Hogwarts, and he couldn't do a thing about it, made him feel trapped and irritable. His mother hadn't come back to check on him or give him any updates. From her reaction to his words earlier, he already understood that he was starting to uncover a sliver of the truth. "We tried to catch her after class," Hermione said, after listening patiently to his complaints, "but she said she had to speak to Dumbledore urgently. They're probably calling an order meeting to talk about it." Harry made a skeptical noise. No one ever listened to him. He still hadn't forgotten how Dumbledore had ignored him at his hearing in August, so why should they start now? All he ever did was cause trouble for Dumbledore and the Order. "Anyway," Hermione continued, pulling her spellbook out of her bag, "Professor Flitwick was talking about vanishing spells." "How can you be thinking about spells right now?" Harry cut her off. "Something big is happening. Don't you want to know what it is?" "Of course I do, Harry," Hermione replied calmly. "But I don't see what we can do. Right now, our job is to study and become proper wizards and witches so that maybe one day we can help the Order for real." "She's right, mate," Ron said tentatively. "It's not like we can go fight you-know-who ourselves." Harry knew they were right, but he found it hard to agree out loud when he felt like he was once again being left in the dark. As curfew approached, Ron and Hermione had to say goodnight and return to the common room. Harry felt lonely and frustrated. Secretly, he wished Ginny had come to visit. He told himself it was because she'd taken his theory about his dad and the ministry much better than Ron or Hermione when he told her about it during the summer, and that maybe he could talk to her about it without her thinking he was seeing things that weren't really there. Madame Pomfrey had already retired to her office, but Harry wasn't tired at all. He tried reading the material Hermione had left him about vanishing spells, but couldn't get through more than a few lines at a time before his mind wandered again to Voldemort. What was he doing now? It was already late when he heard a noise. For a moment he panicked, but convinced himself he'd imagined it. Just to be sure, he got out of bed and looked past the curtain surrounding his bed. The hospital wing was dark and empty, or was it? He thought he saw something pass by the window and approached cautiously. There was nothing there, at least nothing solid. But the way the moonlight poured across the room looked strange. "Don't shout," a voice said in his ear, and he almost did exactly that. "It's just me." Moonlight fell on his father's face. He smiled, and Harry thought that if he hadn't wanted to startle him, he probably shouldn't have snuck in like that. "How did you get in here?" Harry asked, glancing towards Madame Pomfrey's office. "Moody lent me his invisibility cloak," James said, brushing off the cloak. For the first time, Harry noticed it was a dull grey, like a poor imitation of the silvery texture of his own cloak. "It's not as good as ours, but it does the job. Come on, let's get behind the screen before Madame Pomfrey wakes up." They slipped behind the partition around Harry's bed. While his father cast a silencing charm, Harry sat on the edge of the bed, feeling slightly uneasy. Until now, he'd never spent more than a few minutes alone with his father, and the thought of being completely alone with him in the empty hospital wing made him nervous for reasons he couldn't quite explain. "What are you doing here?" he asked, feeling an urgent need to break the silence. "I had to pay my respects," his father replied cryptically, then added, "You've ended up in the hospital wing twice in 3 days. You've beaten my record." Harry gave a faint smile. Parents usually didn't visit their children at Hogwarts except under very special circumstances, but he had the sense that rules like that didn't particularly interest his dad. He still wasn't sure whether he liked that or not. His father sat down in one of the chairs beside the bed. The situation was starting to feel awkward to Harry, so he was glad when his father asked about the Quidditch accident. They talked about it for a few minutes, but the subject soon ran dry. Harry had a feeling there was a deeper reason for his father's late-night visit, and he thought he knew what it was. Growing impatient, he finally asked, "Did Mum tell you what happened?" His father nodded, looking slightly guilty. Harry tried not to show his tension. Had he come to tell him to be a good boy, focus on school, and leave Voldemort and his plans to the Order? Or maybe— "Let's skip the games," James said, with a tone that was almost teasing. "How much do you already know?" Harry lowered his eyes, though deep down he felt a flicker of satisfaction. Finally, someone was treating him like an equal, not like a child. "I know you got Fudge to kick you out of my hearing on purpose," he said. "I know you took something from the ministry, even though the Order told you not to. That's why you were suspended from the Order. And whatever it was, Voldemort wanted it. He needed it. And now—" A strange emptiness crept into Harry's chest, but vanished almost immediately as he met his father's gaze. "And now what?" James asked. Harry wasn't sure. "He's angry, really angry." But angry didn't begin to cover the blazing fury Harry had felt earlier that day. He had never felt anything like it. He hadn't even thought anything human could feel such a terrible emotion. "You can feel what Voldemort feels?" his father asked calmly. Harry tried to read his expression but failed. He shrugged. "Dumbledore said there's some kind of connection between us. That's why my scar's been hurting all the time since he came back." His father didn't look pleased. His eyes flicked to Harry's scar. Harry adjusted his fringe without realizing he was doing it, suddenly feeling the need to shield himself. "At least his explanations are consistent," his father muttered. At first, Harry didn't understand what he meant. Then it dawned on him that his mother must have told him about the Parseltongue revelation. "So I was right?" he asked before his father could bring the matter of Parseltongue. His father gave him a strange smile. "Yes, you were right about all of it." Harry couldn't believe he'd said it. "What was it?" he asked, thirsty for the truth. His father's smile turned a little sad, but maybe that was just a trick of the lamplight. "That I can't tell you. Believe me, I want to, but it's not the right time." "What do you mean?" Something in his father's tone annoyed Harry. James smiled mysteriously, hiding the seriousness behind a mask of nonchalance. Harry hated when he did that. "Order business," he said almost cheerfully. He stood and pulled on his cloak. "I should let you get some rest. Good night, then." "Wait," Harry stopped him. He thought of the day his parents had come with him to his hearing, and it brought something back to him. That thing, it was behind that black door, wasn't it? What's in there? For a moment, his father was speechless. "All right, now you're starting to scare me," he said. "How could you possibly know that?" Harry shrugged. He was pleased he'd uncovered another clue, but at the same time. "I know you're not going to listen to me," his father said, but Harry barely heard him. "But try to forget about it, all right? Don't go looking for what was behind that door. You'll find out when the time is right. Right now, try to focus on, I don't know, Quidditch girls. Try to enjoy your time at Hogwarts. Don't worry about Voldemort." Harry nodded distractedly. His father left, leaving him alone with his thoughts. After a few minutes of silence, Harry wasn't sure whether the meeting had really happened or if it had all been in his head. That night, he dreamed once more that he was walking down a narrow corridor towards a black door. He had dreamed this many times over the summer, so many that it had become familiar, almost comforting. But this time was different. This time, he reached the door, and he knew. It was the same door from the ministry, the one hiding the secret his parents so desperately wanted to keep from him. He reached for the handle, the door opened. He stepped inside. The dream changed. He was flying through the night sky with purpose. The dream was completely lucid. He navigated the sky and landed in the shadow of a manor house. All of the lights inside were out, except for one room on the second floor. He walked inside naturally, as if it were his own house. He moved through the corridors with ease, only the shadow of his tall figure gleaming darkly in a decorative mirror, and stepped into the drawing room. 3 people were sitting in armchairs by the fire. The youngest one, a handsome, well-dressed man in his 40s, jumped to his feet the moment he noticed the intruder. "Who are you?" he demanded in a panic. "Leave before I call the police." He replied, his voice soft and silky, strange to his own ears. "Don't you recognize me, father?" The man stared at him in shock and horror. "Tom, what is he talking about?" the fragile old lady in the other chair asked fearfully. "It can't be," Tom cried. "It's time to pay for your sins, father," he said to him, pure hatred bubbling inside him like lava. "Avada Kedavra." Harry woke with a jolt to the sound of a scream. Dawn light was seeping into the hospital wing. His heart was pounding at an inhuman pace, and cold sweat drenched his back. His scar burned like an open flame. Only when Madame Pomfrey hurried to his side and began checking him with concern did he realize he had been the one who screamed. Even after Madame Pomfrey was satisfied he was fine and insisted it had only been a nightmare, the terror wouldn't let go of Harry. He lay in the bed, trying not to shake or draw the matron's attention, and tried to understand what was the meaning of that strange and frightening dream that already started to slip through his fingers. But as much as he tried, the less he remembered of the dream, until there was nothing left but the chilling sense of terror. Chapter 25. Snitches and Other Troubles. Ginny squinted into the setting sun as she flew past the eastern goalposts. The new broom responded to her slightest movement, and the smooth, speedy flight was a major upgrade from the old brooms she and her brothers used at home. She didn't think she'd ever be able to go back to those. after experiencing the freedom and power of flying a real broomstick. She imagined the empty stands packed with spectators, all cheering her name after a brilliant goal. They were calling her name, not the youngest daughter of Arthur and Marley, not just another Weasley, not the girl who had to be rescued from the Chamber of Secrets, but her own name. She snapped out of her daydream, suddenly remembering where she was. She pushed her hair from her face and looked down. Ron was standing in the middle of the pitch in his Gryffindor Quidditch robes, gesturing impatiently for her to come down. "Give me 10 more minutes," she called back firmly, hovering a few meters above him. "Practice doesn't start for half an hour, does it?" "I need to warm up before that," Ron said, his ears turning red for some reason. All right," Ginny replied, realizing it was a sensitive topic for him. She was just landing when she noticed Harry walking towards them across the grass, his firebolt slung over his shoulder. "What are you doing here so early?" Ron asked. "Hermione's giving a lecture about SPEW in the common room," Harry replied. "I snuck out when she started talking to some second years about collecting donations. I'm supposed to be the treasurer." "I thought he was the treasurer," Ron said in confusion. "Anyway, what are you two doing out here?" Harry asked. "Ron promised to let me have a go on the clean sweep," Ginny answered before Ron could, glancing at her brother. "Only now he's kicking me off because he needs to start warming up an hour before everyone else." Ron snatched the broom from her hand, muttered something grumpy about being prepared, and shot off into the sky. "He's just nervous," Harry said, defending him. "Fred and George are giving him hell, aren't they?" she replied, well aware of how much the twins enjoyed teasing Ron. "Yeah," Harry said. The conversation trailed into an awkward silence as they watched Ron practicing feints near the goalposts. "How's your arm?" Ginny asked. "Good as new," Harry replied a bit too quickly, rotating his right arm as if to prove it was working properly. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but kept quiet. "What?" Ginny asked. "Nothing," he said. "I just wondered. You know, out of curiosity, you're always hanging around with that Ravenclaw bloke from my year." "Michael." "Yeah," Harry said quickly. "I can never remember his name." The conversation died again. Suddenly, Ginny felt a twinge of annoyance towards Harry. He wanted to ask her about her and Michael. That much was obvious. Did he think she hadn't noticed how strangely he'd been acting around her lately? "We're going out," she said plainly. "Who?" Harry blurted, sounding almost stupid. "Oh, yeah, figured as much." "Right," Ginny said firmly. "I'd better get back." "Wait," Harry said as she turned to leave. "I meant to ask if you wanted a go on the firebolt before practice starts." Ginny stopped and stared at him in disbelief. "Seriously?" "Yeah," Harry said casually. Ginny was glad to see him starting to get a grip on his weirdness. "Why not? As long as you don't crash it. I saw you flying earlier. You're decent." "Decent," Ginny repeated pointedly. Harry grinned. "You want to fly or not?" Ginny considered it for a moment. Of course, she wanted a go on one of the fastest brooms in the world, but she also didn't want to give Harry the wrong idea. If she was being honest, it felt pretty good that he was finally seeing her as more than just his best mate's little sister. But she wasn't the shy, awkward girl who used to drop things whenever he walked past. She was with Michael now, and she wasn't about to toss him aside just because Harry Potter had finally noticed her. Still flying the firebolt. Finally, she agreed, and she didn't regret it. She had never imagined anything like it. The broom carried her with perfect lightness, as if she weighed no more than a feather, and it responded so quickly and precisely it felt like it could read her mind. She flew a few wide loops around the pitch, the evening wind stinging her face and bare hands. Afterwards, Harry opened the crate of balls, and she helped Ron warm up by trying to score with the quaffle. After 4 goals in a row, she started missing on purpose, since other team members had started arriving. By the time Ginny landed, the sun had vanished behind the stands. Her nose and fingers were numb, but it was worth it. If you die, can I have it? She asked Harry as she handed the broom back. Don't say that when Angelina's around, said George, nodding towards Angelina, who was chatting with the other chasers behind him. She thinks Harry's about to drop dead any second and leave the team without a seeker. Speaking of which, said Fred, when did you learn to fly like that? We never let you play with us over the holidays. I've been sneaking out and nicking your brooms since I was about 6, Ginny replied smugly. Angelina joined them. You were brilliant up there, she told Ginny. I asked McGonagall about adding a reserve seeker in case Potter gets smacked by another bludger and ends up in the hospital wing. That could have happened to anyone, Harry protested. Anyway, Angelina continued, ignoring him and turning back to Ginny. What do you think? You're serious? Ginny asked, barely believing her luck. She loved Quidditch. Flying was one of her favorite things in the world, but she never thought she'd actually make the team, even though she daydreamed about it often. Of course, I'll do it. Excellent, said Angelina, satisfied. I'll tell McGonagall tomorrow. Technically, you're not supposed to train, but you'll want to stay in shape. You never know with him. I am standing right here, Harry said grumpily. Hey, don't get too excited, said Fred with mock concern. Yeah, we don't want you back in the hospital, said George. Bugger off, Harry mumbled. Ginny returned to the castle in especially high spirits. Of all the team, Ron was the only one who didn't look pleased about her being named Reserve Seeker, but she wasn't going to let that spoil things. She couldn't really blame Ron for not being entirely thrilled. It probably made his achievement feel a bit less impressive when she got onto the team so easily, even if only as a reserve. But she knew Ron would just have to grit his teeth and keep doing his best, like everyone else. After the Chamber of Secrets, everything else seemed so small. All the things that used to bother her, her family's reputation, her brothers teasing her, hand-me-downs, for a while, none of that mattered. She'd been so close to death down there. It felt like an utter waste to spend life worrying about stupid things. And after seeing how her fears and insecurities could be used against her, she'd sworn never to be that scared little girl again. She wouldn't wish what happened on anyone, especially not Ron, but she still thought it was something he needed to learn. He should be glad to be on the team and stop worrying about what everyone else thought. The truth was, once he gained a bit of confidence, he wasn't half bad as a keeper. Pushing Ron from her mind and returning to thoughts of Quidditch, Ginny hurried to Gryffindor Tower to tell her friends the news, feeling like she was floating a few inches off the ground. But the perfect lightness didn't last long. The next morning, on her way to the Gryffindor table, she spotted Michael sitting with his back to her at the Ravenclaw table. She motioned for her friends to go ahead without her and approached him, catching him mid-conversation. "Morning," she said brightly. To her surprise, he gave her a scowl. "Where were you last night?" She was about to ask what he meant, then remembered. "I'm so sorry." In all the excitement, she'd completely forgotten they'd planned to study together in the library the night before. It totally slipped my mind. "Yeah, I noticed," he said with bitterness. "I looked like an idiot, sitting there on my own all night." "I said I'm sorry," Ginny said again, feeling he was being a bit dramatic. She was glad everyone around them was too absorbed in their own conversations to notice the argument. "I went to the pitch with my brother to try out his new broom, and the Gryffindor captain saw me and asked if I wanted to join the team as a reserve. I got so excited I forgot about studying." She hadn't expected him to jump for joy, but she thought he'd at least say something supportive. Apparently, that was hoping for too much. Michael didn't seem impressed at all. "What do you want me to say?" she asked when he said nothing, starting to feel hurt. "I said I'm sorry I forgot. Haven't you ever forgotten something?" Deciding he didn't deserve the dignity of a response, she turned on her heel and strode back towards the Gryffindor table. She spent the rest of the morning in a foul mood. Why did Michael have to be such a prat? Couldn't he at least be happy for her? She knew that if he had got onto the Ravenclaw team, she'd be thrilled for him, even if he'd forgotten a library date. She was so irritated that, during transfiguration, the tortoise she was meant to turn into a jewelry box leapt into the air and landed on her friend Miranda's head. Miranda was so mortified she refused to speak to Ginny or accept her apology for the rest of the class. Ginny, not in the mood to beg for forgiveness, gathered her things the moment the bell rang and left the classroom on her own. She was the first student to arrive at Professor Trelawney's dark and stuffy classroom. She climbed the ladder that descended from the ceiling and grabbed a poof in the corner, tossing her bag onto the table and flopping her head down in frustration. The classroom began to fill slowly. Ginny saw Miranda and Erin come through the trapdoor and pointedly ignored them. They picked a table on the far side and began whispering. Ginny knew they were talking about her. "You probably shouldn't do that." Ginny lifted her head in confusion. Luna Lovegood was standing in front of her table, her hair pulled back with a headband made of real flowers. In the dim light, her pale skin looked almost luminous. "Do what?" Ginny asked tiredly. "Sleep here," Luna said, pointing to the heavy velvet curtains that trailed onto the floor nearby. "The curtains are full of wormats. They love human hair, especially red hair." Ginny didn't know what wormats were, but she decided not to ask. Luna had a reputation for believing in all sorts of strange creatures and stories. The curtains looked perfectly innocent. Thanks, I think." "I heard you this morning saying you made the Gryffindor team," Luna continued in her usual airy tone. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but you really were speaking very loudly. Well done, you must be really good. Make sure you beat Slytherin next month." "Thanks," Ginny said, confused but sincere. Her friends had congratulated her when she told them the news, but for some reason it felt like Luna actually meant it, rather than just saying what she thought Ginny wanted to hear. Ginny wasn't used to being around girls like that, apart from Hermione. She looked around. The classroom was filling up quickly. "Hey, want to sit here?" she asked Luna, who was drawing mocking glances from those nearby. "Oh, yes," Luna replied, with genuine excitement in her voice, and plopped down on the beanbag next to Ginny. "No one ever asks to sit with me." "People are idiots," Ginny said, and she truly meant it. She had an unexpectedly enjoyable lesson with Luna. Unlike her friends, Luna didn't waste time chattering and skiving off the task. Instead, they stared together into the crystal ball and laughed as they tried to describe the weird shapes they saw inside it. By the end of the lesson, they left the classroom together, walking side by side for a few minutes, chatting, until Luna turned off for ancient runes and Ginny headed to Muggle studies. "So you're mates with Loony Luna now," Miranda teased as she caught up with her on the third floor. Erin had probably gone to runes too. "And if I am," Ginny replied sharply. She wanted to tell Miranda not to call Luna that, but she thought it might sound a bit hypocritical. After all, she'd called her that herself up until that lesson. "I'm only joking," Miranda said. "Let's not fight, Ginny." Ginny didn't reply immediately, unwilling to point out that Miranda had started it. "I'm not apologizing again," she said eventually. "You don't have to," Miranda replied, linking her arm through Ginny's. "Apology accepted, friends." A small smile crept onto Ginny's face, almost against her will. After the Chamber of Secrets, Miranda had been the first to approach her. She'd apologized for never noticing anything was wrong and had asked her to be friends. It was thanks to her that Ginny had become part of the group of girls in her year, instead of feeling alone all the time. "Friends," she replied, and though she hadn't meant to, she added, "and I really am sorry about the toad. I was furious with Michael. I lost control." "I think you owe me," Miranda said playfully as they turned down the corridor leading to Muggle studies. "You need to set me up with someone." "Who?" Ginny asked. "Dunno, one of Michael's mates." "They're all idiots," Ginny said. "You're not wrong," Miranda admitted. They took their seats in the classroom, waiting for the lesson to start. Miranda rested her pretty face on her hand, her large dark eyes watching Ginny. "What about someone on the team?" All the boys on the team are my brothers, Ginny said with a grimace. Gross. Harry Potter isn't your brother, Miranda said in a sing-song voice. Harry, Ginny repeated slowly. Yeah, Miranda said with satisfaction. He's really shot up over the summer, and he's famous. So, will you introduce me? Ginny hesitated. It was hard to agree straight away, knowing that Harry fancied her. It didn't seem fair to let her friend get her hopes up. Then again, what if Harry eventually realized Ginny was taken and decided to move on and start dating Miranda? Ginny didn't like that idea. Please, Ginny, Miranda begged. You've got Michael, don't I deserve someone too? Professor Babbage entered the room and the lesson began. Realizing there was no escape, Ginny whispered to Miranda, all right, after dinner. At dinner, Ginny went straight to the Gryffindor table without looking for Michael at the Ravenclaw table. She was still a little cross with him and figured he should be the one to come and apologize. She sat with her friends, who were chatting about the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend, set for mid-October. Miranda was unusually quiet. Ginny suspected she didn't want everyone knowing she had her eye on a boy who didn't even know her name. Usually, it was boys chasing after Miranda, not the other way around. Ginny, for her part, was happy not to talk about it. On the first day of the term, Poppy had told the group that her parents believed the ministry's version of the events in June and warned her to stay away from Harry, and Elizabeth had even said he'd always given her the creeps. That had sparked a long argument between them and Ginny, who tried to explain that Harry wasn't lying and that he, who must not be named, really had returned, only to eventually settle on an irritating compromise. None of them could really know what had happened at the end of last year. After dinner, the girls went back to the common room, where they claimed armchairs near the fire and started on their homework. After a while, the portrait hole opened, and Harry stepped inside alone, heading straight for one of the empty side tables. He had that same expression Ginny didn't like he wasn't really there. She dropped her gaze back to her homework and desperately hoped Miranda hadn't noticed him, but a second later she felt her tug on her sleeve. For a moment she considered telling her it was a bad idea, but stopped herself. Why shouldn't it be a good idea? Just because for some reason Harry unsettled her when he was like this. That was stupid. She took Miranda's hand, and together they approached Harry's table. He was acting strangely, and Ginny hoped Miranda hadn't picked up on it. His robes were draped over the back of his chair, and he was sitting on the edge of his seat, staring intently at a blank bit of parchment spread in front of him. Hey, Harry, Ginny said loudly. He didn't jump. He looked up and smiled at her, giving Miranda a slightly uncertain glance. The odd look vanished without a trace. Hey, he said calmly, how's it going? Nothing much, Ginny replied quickly. This is my friend Miranda. Hello, Miranda said sweetly. Nice to meet you, Harry replied, sounding a little confused. Sensing the awkwardness, Ginny jumped in. Where are Ron and Hermione? They've got perfect duties, Harry said, sounding none too pleased. Didn't get a chance to tell you. You were brilliant yesterday. Thanks, Ginny replied, blushing despite herself. Not everyone's so happy for me. Ron'll get over it, Harry said, not realizing she meant Michael. If he wants to be on the team, he needs to want us to win, even if it means you get on the team too. Not that it stops him from going on about it. Ginny gave a small laugh. We should get some practice in some time, Harry said suddenly. You've got to stay in shape, since apparently I'm accident-prone. I could show you a few moves. Ginny snorted. I don't need you to show memos, thanks. Why not? Harry asked, confused. Ginny realized he actually hadn't meant it as a double entendre. She turned to look at Miranda to see if she'd picked up on it, but only then did she notice her friend was gone. She looked behind her and saw Miranda sitting with the other girls, back turned to her. What's that about? Harry asked. Nothing, Ginny replied, dropping heavily into the armchair beside him. She really wasn't in the mood for Miranda's drama tonight. What were you saying? Just that, for the sake of the team, You should take all the help you can get, Harry said, leaning back in his chair. There's not much I'm good at. Actually, the only thing I am good at is Quidditch. And if I can use that to wipe the smug look off Malfoy's face, I will. Ginny rolled her eyes a little, then added, I'm sure that's not true. I bet there are loads of things you're good at. Not really, Harry said, clearly giving it real thought. The Dursleys never encouraged me to develop my talents. I spent most of my time running from Dudley and his lot. I don't know, maybe dueling. I'm definitely good at surviving. That's a pretty useful talent, Ginny said firmly. I'd choose knowing how to defend myself over catching the snitch any day. Seriously. Of course. Especially now that you know who is back, we need to learn to protect ourselves. What your mum is teaching us in defense against the dark arts won't cut it when the danger's real, will it? You learned all that stuff on your own for the Triwizard Tournament, didn't you? Harry nodded slowly. Ginny realized a moment too late that this was a sensitive subject. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring that up. It's all right, Harry said at once, not looking at her. You're right, but it's hard to convince people to prepare for danger when they don't believe it exists. Ginny didn't miss the bitterness in his voice. That's their choice, she said, leaning forward. But think about it. We could get permission to start a club like the Garbstones Club, but for people who want to learn dueling. Your mum could run the meetings, or maybe you. Me, Harry echoed with a crooked smile. That's mad. Maybe, Ginny said, leaning back again. But people say we're mad, and you're not that bad. Harry laughed. Ginny felt an odd sense of satisfaction. Just then, Ron and Hermione came through the portrait hole, arguing fiercely. They joined Harry and Ginny's table, dropped their bags, and carried on bickering. See you, Ginny said quietly to Harry, not wanting to get caught in the middle, and returned to her friends. Miranda was nowhere to be seen. She went to bed early, Poppy said, giving Ginny a sharp look that made it clear they all knew exactly what had happened. The next day, Miranda didn't speak to Ginny, and the other girls sided with her. Erin told her in secret, when they were alone in the bathroom between charms and potions, that Miranda was upset because Ginny had flirted with Harry, even though Sheck knew Miranda liked him. That's not how it was at all, Ginny protested. We were just talking about Quidditch. Erin only shrugged, half not believing her, half not caring. Ginny spent the day alone. She hated feeling excluded, shut out, and Miranda knew that. She was using it against her, but Ginny wasn't about to let it break her. She looked for Luna between lessons, but couldn't find her. She was beginning to realize Luna might be the only person who could ever truly understand her. It was a depressing thought. She was heading to the Great Hall for lunch, feeling gloomier by the minute, when Michael appeared from the crowd and pulled her aside. Hey, he said awkwardly. Hi, she replied coolly, waiting for an apology. Is it true that Harry Potter hit on you yesterday? Michael asked. What? Ginny said, confused and angry. Who told you that? No one. That's just what everyone's saying, Michael replied, uncomfortable. Is it true? No, Ginny said, her anger rising. It's that stupid Miranda spreading rumors about me. I see, Michael said, looking a little ashamed. Listen, I'm sorry I acted like a prat. I was hurt. I really am happy for you about making the team. Truly, do you forgive me? A faint smile touched Ginny's lips. It wasn't quite the apology she'd wanted, but given everything, it was a start. I already have, she said. Michael smiled and took her hand, and together they merged back into the stream of students. Ginny was just glad she wasn't alone anymore. Chapter 26. Into the Heart of the Forest. He was asleep, like he had been most of the time these days. Deep in his dream of snow-covered forests and rats, he heard footsteps in the entrance hall far below and knew the house was filling up for another order meeting. But he didn't want to wake up. Wakefulness only brought loneliness and sadness, whereas sleep brought a comforting, peaceful darkness. Footsteps echoed outside Sirius's room. Padfoot pricked up his ears and opened one eye to identify the person disturbing his rest. There was no mistaking those soft steps and the way he knocked on the door. "Sirius," Remus's voice came from beyond the door, just as Padfoot sank back silently onto the bed. "Are you in there?" The door opened. If Remus was surprised to find his friend lying on the bed in dog form at 6 in the evening, he didn't show it. "The meeting's about to start," he said. When Padfoot didn't stir, he approached the bed and tapped him on the nose with his wand. The dog let out a yelp of surprise and pain before transforming back into his human self. The dull ache in his chest, the one that never left when he chose to be human, immediately returned. Sometimes it felt like a tiny dementor had made a home in his chest, sucking out his life force and replacing it with fear and despair. A flicker of pity passed across Remus's face at the sight of his friend, but it vanished before Sirius could take offense. His hair and beard were longer than ever, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd changed his shirt. It was one of the reasons he preferred to stay in his animagus form. He didn't want their pity. "It's a waste of time," he said hoarsely. "I don't need to sit and listen to how everyone's risking their lives for the Order while I sit here twiddling my thumbs." "Stop feeling sorry for yourself and come downstairs," Remus replied, already on his way out. "Trust me, you'll want to be there tonight." Sirius's curiosity was piqued. Remus clearly had news about the werewolves. He'd been trying to persuade them not to join Voldemort since the summer began. Sirius got up slowly, dressed, and joined the meeting late. Bill was speaking when he entered, and Sirius appreciated that he didn't pause or stumble at his appearance in the kitchen doorway, but simply carried on reporting on the financial activities of known Death Eaters at Gringotts. Several Order members shot Sirius cautious glances as he took his seat. Part of him wished one of them would dare say something, especially Snape, who looked at him with open disdain, but no one spoke. Sirius sat beside Tonks, who gave him an encouraging smile. He managed a half-hearted one in return. The sight of his cousin's daughter with her bubblegum pink hair was oddly cheering amidst the candlelit gloom of the basement room, full of somber-faced witches and wizards. Sirius's thoughts wandered as Kingsley took over, reporting that Scrimgeour, head of the Auror office, was planning one-on-one interviews with each of his staff, clearly to determine their loyalties to the Ministry. Since Azkaban, Sirius's concentration had been all but non-existent, and his thoughts drifted to darker places whenever left idle. He looked at Lily and James, who were listening intently to Kingsley's report. James had wisely kept a low profile since his suspension ended, but Sirius almost wished he'd say something to stir the pot, something to break the constant replay of that image. James's corpse sprawled across the floor in Godric's Hollow, flickering at the edge of Sirius's vision every time he looked at him. He'd thought having Lily and James alive, safe and living in Grimmauld Place, would ease the ache in his chest. But it hadn't. He'd had 2 months of reprieve when they two were confined to the house, and children ran through the halls at all hours. But now Lily spent most of her time at Hogwarts. James was constantly away on Order business, and the kids had returned for another glorious year at school. Sirius was left with little solace other than the rare evenings with James and Remus, drinking fire whiskey and reminiscing, and the scattered, short letters Harry sent him. The loneliness swelled inside him and spilled out, filling the house, making him feel utterly alone, even when surrounded by everyone he loved. What was the point of being around the people you cared about if none of them could truly understand you? Someone said his name. He jolted out of his thoughts to find everyone looking at him again. "What?" he asked. Snape snorted derisively. "I was just saying," Remus said calmly before Sirius could retort, the candlelight casting deep shadows across his face, making him look oddly younger, that what most werewolves value above all else is power. That's why they'd rather join Voldemort than oppose him or remain neutral. That's why they won't listen to me. They know I've always tried to live like a respectable wizard, but they might listen to you." "Me?" Sirius echoed. not believing what he was hearing. Yes, you, Remus replied, a flicker of a smile on his lips. To the wizarding world, you're a ruthless mass murderer, Voldemort's right-hand man. You've got all the traits they admire: cruelty, dominance, and a lust for power. But that's not who he is, Tonks said, glancing at Sirius with concern. They don't know that, Remus answered. Sirius recognized the spark in his eyes, the same spark he remembered from their youth when they'd planned grand adventures. It was like a flame starting to melt the ice around his heart. It's too dangerous, Hester Jones said. What if he gets caught? I doubt they'll call the ministry, James said, calmly backing Sirius, unless they fancy a stint in Azkaban themselves. And if the full moon comes while we're with them, Sirius can transform. Werewolves don't attack animals, Remus added. Assuming they don't decide to tear him apart anyway, growled Mad-Eye Moody, his normal eye fixed on Sirius. Either way, it's Black's call. Well, Remus asked, will you play the part? For the first time in weeks, Sirius smiled, truly smiled. I was born for the part, he said. At the end of the meeting, he approached Remus as he locked the door behind Tonks. The house returned to its usual hollow silence once everyone had gone. Thanks, Mooney, Sirius said, hands buried deep in his pockets. Don't thank me, Remus replied gently. It wasn't a favor. I suggested you because I honestly think you're the best wizard for the job. Still, Sirius insisted. He couldn't quite put into words how much it meant to have someone believe in him. Thank you. The next day, they began preparing for their journey. Remus went to Diagon Alley to buy Sirius a warm traveling cloak and boots, while Sirius packed provisions and an old tent that had once belonged to Remus's father. In the afternoon, the two of them went up to the attic with James. The wide space with its low ceiling was dusty and cobwebbed, as though rebelling against the order they had tried to impose on the house since the summer. A single window at the far end cast a dim light on boxes overflowing with the Black family's old belongings. We can't show up empty-handed, Remus explained to his friends in that serious, faintly distasteful tone he always used when speaking about his kind. And we have to give them a reason not to kill us on sight. They won't do that if they think we have more to offer. They're welcome to take whatever they want, Sirius said, balancing a golden goblet engraved with the Black family's crest on the tip of his finger. It can't be anything bearing the Black family emblem or any other mark that might trace it back to you, said Remus, tossing into the sack a giant pearl necklace that had belonged to Sirius's mother. You never know where this could end up, and it might raise questions. Mooney always thinks of everything, James said, rummaging through one of the crates. What about this? He held up a golden locket on a chain. It was set with green gemstones in the shape of an S and seemed to shimmer in the gloom of the attic. Sirius stepped toward it slowly, almost entranced. He tried to remember if he had seen it around the house before, but couldn't. Something about the golden glint on the chain stirred a deep memory in him, but the feeling slipped through his fingers like water. Feels odd, doesn't it? James's voice pulled Sirius out of his thoughts. It's probably cursed or something. Remus approached and tapped the locket with his wand, muttering a few incantations. Nothing happened. Not enough to be dangerous, apparently, he said, opening the sack for James. Put it in here. They'll be pleased. That night before they left, Sirius couldn't sleep. He didn't transform into Padfoot. He didn't want to silence the thoughts in his head for once. He tried not to feel like an excited child, though that was exactly how he felt. Just the idea of open spaces and forests, after so long shut away in his childhood home, filled him with a vast hope. He lay awake in bed until the small hours and spent the rest of the night in the bathroom. After a long moment staring at his reflection, he summoned a pair of scissors and began trimming his hair and beard until they were both short and bristly. It was almost painful, because without the long hair and beard his face was fully visible, thin and hollow like a skull. But his eyes still burned in their sockets with the fire of determination, the same fire that had given him the strength to escape Azkaban. He smiled at the reflection in the mirror, and for a fraction of a second, he could see the man he once was. They left at dawn. Lily came down to the kitchen in her dressing gown to wish them luck and remind them to be careful, handing them a parcel of pies Marley had baked for them. "That's kind of her," said Remus to Sirius, aware of the tension between him and Marley. He, too, had changed his appearance in preparation for their mission. His stubble had grown in, and his hair was slightly longer. "Yeah," Sirius replied curtly, though he had to admit it really was thoughtful of her. James joined them, dressed and ready. He was coming along to their starting point, so he'd know where to look for them if contact was lost. "What happened to your hair?" he asked Sirius. "It's called a haircut. You should try one sometime," Sirius shot back. "Ready to go," Remus interrupted their friendly banter. Sirius grabbed his rucksack, while James kissed Lily on the cheek, and the three friends disapparated. They appeared on a hillside at the edge of a dense forest. The sun had yet to rise above the treetops, painting the thin autumn clouds pink and yellow. The air was cold and crisp, and Sirius breathed it in deeply, able almost to taste the freedom. The silence around him was not the silence of a cold cell or an empty childhood home, but the silence of open spaces, a silence that healed rather than hurt. "Wish I could come with you," James said wistfully, after Remus showed him the planned route on the map. "I don't think you know what you're asking," Remus replied. "I'd choose going home to my wife every evening over traipsing through a forest looking for a werewolf pack." James gave a dry chuckle that confirmed Remus was right. They parted with a promise to send regular updates, and Remus and Sirius stepped into the forest. The days in the forest passed slowly, as though time moved differently between the trees. But Sirius didn't mind. Their mission might take days, even weeks, and part of him hoped they'd never find the pack. He would have been content to spend the rest of his life in that forest, waking each morning to the clear dawn and walking until sunset, when the sky filled with bright stars and moonlight. Freedom thrummed in his veins, and the feeling was addictive. With each passing day, it became harder to stop dreaming that this could be his new life, and yet he couldn't shake the knowledge that when the mission ended, he would be returned to his prison. One evening, nearly a week into their journey, Sirius and Remus made a campfire outside their tent and finished off the last of Marley's pies. The night was cold, but Sirius had no intention of spending his precious moments of freedom cooped up in the cramped, enchanted tent. Remus was quiet. He had been ever since they entered the forest, speaking little and in low tones. Sirius watched him bite into a pie, his longer beard and hair giving him a wild look that didn't suit him. The forest had brought out a hidden side of him, one that always lurked just beneath the surface, and that he kept to himself for fear of driving others away. But Sirius liked that side of him. He hadn't seen it in years. "What?" Remus asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," Sirius said, "just remembering." "You know," Remus said, finishing the last bite of pie, "I thought you'd be unbearable. I thought you complain non-stop and have no patience for all this searching." "Well, I'm a changed man," Sirius replied, attempting a joke, though he wasn't sure it landed. "But was I really that bad?" "You've no idea," Remus said fondly, tossing another stick into the fire. "I don't know how I put up with you. You know you can't live without me, Mooney." Sirius was laughing, but Remus suddenly grew serious. He began to say something, but Sirius cut him off before he could. "Don't you start apologizing now," he said firmly. "It's behind us." Remus nodded heavily. Sirius found himself wishing James had come with them. He would have known how to break the tense silence that settled between them. "So," he said, desperate to find something to talk about. He used to be good at that, but 12 years of silence had left their mark. "Are you finally going to tell me what's going on between you and Tonks?" "What?" Remus asked, startled. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about," Sirius said, looking for the blush on his friend's face in the firelight. Sure enough, it was there, just like when they were young. You're imagining things, Remus said, less convincingly this time, and stabbed the embers unnecessarily. I'm happy for you, really, Sirius went on, feeling cheerier. He took a bit of wicked joy in teasing his friend. I think it's brilliant. If you two get married, we'll be family. No one's getting married, Remus growled, blushing deeper. I can't believe you'd even suggest it. She could be my daughter. That would have been quite a feat, considering we were 13 when she was born. You know what I mean. I don't see the problem, Sirius said, stretching his legs out towards the fire. You're both adults, and it's obvious she's head over heels for you, and you can't take your eyes off her. It's not going to happen, Padfoot, Remus insisted. Look, have you ever loved someone so much you'd do anything to protect them, even if it meant never seeing them again? You know I have, Sirius said heavily, thinking of the day Lily and James went into hiding with Harry and let everyone believe Sirius was their secret keeper, when in fact they'd chosen Wormtail. Then you understand why I can't let it happen, Remus said quietly. What exactly are you protecting her from? Sirius asked. And don't tell me it's you. Remus didn't answer straight away. He stared into the surrounding darkness, deep in thought. You're a good friend, Sirius, he said at last. You've stood by me through dozens of transformations, risked your life and your reputation for me. But there's still a lot you don't know about werewolves. Don't look at me like that, he added, seeing Sirius roll his eyes. If you think I'm exaggerating, wait until you meet my kind. They're not your kind, Sirius said fiercely. You're nothing like them, do you hear me? Remus gave a patient, sad smile that irritated Sirius. He knew his friend wasn't speaking from fear or hatred of the beast he became each full moon, but from hard-earned experience. We should get some sleep, he said, as if the conversation had never happened. Sirius already regretted mentioning Tonks. I'll take first watch, he said. Remus said goodnight and ducked into the tent. Sirius leaned back against a tree trunk and stared into the fire. The ache in his chest returned, though he wasn't quite sure why. He drifted into thought as the night deepened. At some point, he must have dozed off. The fire was burning low, and a half-moon shone faintly through the branches above. Shivering, Sirius added more wood to the fire and strengthened it with a charm. The flames flared up suddenly, and for a brief second he was certain someone was standing there, directly across from him. But when he looked straight at them, they vanished. Their search dragged on. After 10 days, they found tracks leading east, but even after 3 more days, they encountered no one. Remus grew impatient and irritable, barely speaking for hours at a time, and Sirius, seeing his friend's determination, didn't dare suggest they turn back. Something strange was definitely happening in that forest. Of that Sirius had no doubt. Remus could get moody and even snappish before the full moon, but it was never like this. And whatever it was that made him behave so unlike himself was affecting Sirius too. Every few nights he would see that same figure again, appearing and vanishing without explanation, until he could no longer convince himself it was just his imagination. The problem was, he thought he knew who he was seeing. It all came to a head in the 3rd week of their journey. The day was cloudy and windswept, and it felt like the forest would never end. Sirius found himself sinking into deepening despair when suddenly the wind died, and a ringing silence fell over the woods. Remus stopped abruptly, listening intently. "Do you hear something?" Sirius whispered. "SHH," Remus muttered, straining to catch something Sirius couldn't. "I don't," I said quiet. Frightened birds burst from a nearby tree, and before Sirius could react, Remus's hand clamped around his throat. Rage blazed in his eyes, murderous almost, but only for a second before it was replaced with confusion and guilt. He let go of Sirius as if burned. "I'm sorry," he said weakly, almost fearfully. "I don't know what came over me." "It's all right," Sirius said cautiously, rubbing his throat. The outburst was alarming, but it had passed as quickly as it came, leaving Remus as he'd always known him. It's probably the full moon. Probably, Remus agreed, sitting down on a nearby rock and massaging his temples. The wind picked up again. Sirius, I'm so sorry. It's nothing, Sirius said. 3 weeks in the woods would drive anyone mad. You look terrible. Give me your pack. Remus tried to argue, but eventually gave in and let Sirius carry his bag for the rest of the day. The full moon was only 2 days away, and it showed. Remus looked pale and unwell. That night, Remus took first watch while Sirius went to sleep in the tent. On the outside, it looked like any other canvas tent, but inside it was a hunter's cabin, lined with rough wooden beams, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 narrow beds. Remus's father used to live in it, while monitoring magical creatures in far-flung places. It felt like Sirius had only just laid his head on the pillow when he suddenly awoke. He struggled to open his eyes, thinking it might be time to relieve Remus, but the fire was blazing in the hearth as though no time had passed. He wasn't alone. He sat up sharply, grabbing his wand and pointing it at the intruder. A young man stood in the center of the cabin, wearing a black cloak and a heavy golden locket around his thin neck. Sirius's breath caught in his throat. It was Regulus, his younger brother who had died in the First War, no older than the last time Sirius had seen him. The firelight danced on the locket and in his sad black eyes. "Are you real?" Sirius asked in a low voice. Regulus didn't answer. His image was pale and wavering, his dark hair moving softly as if he was submerged under water. He only looked down and touched his locket. It was the one they'd found in the attic. Sirius cautiously approached Remus's pack, never taking his eyes off the figure of his brother, and pulled out the sack that held the werewolf's payment. Regulus smiled his knowing smile, that infuriating one from when they were young, and watched as Sirius removed the golden locket set with green gems. Sirius stared at the object intently. Now, looking at it up close, a memory stirred in the back of his mind. It was elusive, formless, taunting him with the promise of understanding before slipping away again. It was important. He knew that, but he couldn't remember why. It was maddening. He jumped. For a moment, he'd been certain Regulus had spoken, but he was kneeling alone on the floor, and Remus was standing in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. Sirius realized he was still holding the locket. "Something came back to me," he said quickly, examining the locket again, but the memory had vanished. "I'm not sure. I think it might have belonged to my brother." "Do you want to keep it?" "No," Sirius said sharply, though he wasn't sure why he felt so angry. "No, I don't want anything to do with it." Remus sighed and nodded. "We need to get out of this forest, Padfoot." Their wish came true the next day. They woke at dawn to the smell of smoke and knew they were close to their destination. "They must have traveled all night and made camp in the morning," Remus said as they packed up in haste. "If we're lucky, we'll deal with them and be gone before sunset." Sirius certainly hoped they would stick to that schedule. One of the greatest joys of his life had been running under the full moon with Mooney and Prongs, but he had no desire to be around when dozens of werewolves transformed. They had barely left the spot where they had camped when a voice called out behind them. "Well, well, what do we have here?" They both spun around sharply. Sirius hadn't heard anyone approach, and yet a man now stood behind them. He looked utterly unkempt, which said something, coming from a fugitive from Azkaban. His clothes were tattered and torn, his hair and beard were long and matted, and his face and large hands were streaked with grime. A werewolf, but not the friendly sort. "Thought they told you not to come back," he said to Remus with a sneer. His accent was thick and rough. "We brought gifts," Remus replied coolly, showing the werewolf the contents of the sack, filled with the Black family's treasures. The man licked his lips greedily. "And what's stopping me from just taking those lovely gifts for myself?" he asked in a dangerous tone. "The fear of losing your guts," Sirius growled. He had a feeling he was going to enjoy this. "You going to do that to me, little wizard?" the werewolf laughed. Well, well, seems wizards aren't all soft and sweet like they want us to think. Sirius drew his wand, and with a swift flick, sent a curse that slammed the werewolf hard against a nearby tree. The name's Black. Maybe you've heard of me, Sirius said, wand aimed casually at the fallen man. I'd like a word with your boss. Black! A flicker of fear passed through the werewolf's eyes. He tried to mask it with amusement, but it was clear he recognized Sirius's reputation. Wa'd have thought this is the company you keep, Lupin. All right, I'll take you. He led them deeper into the forest. As they walked, the scent of meat and smoke grew stronger, but no sound reached them besides the natural rustling of the woods. An unsuspecting hiker could have stumbled into the camp without even realizing, until it was too late. Werewolves sat among the trees, alone or in small groups, chewing their meals with focus or whispering quietly. All eyes turned towards Remus and Sirius as they entered the territory. Sirius made sure to look unbothered, though that was far from the truth. At the center of the camp sat the most scarred and menacing group of people Sirius had ever seen. They could easily have competed with Mad-Eye Moody in the missing eyes and noses department. Remus threw the sack at the feet of the youngest among them, the only one whose face and limbs weren't marred. He was younger than Remus and Sirius, his face handsome and smooth, apart from a large scar slashing through his left eyebrow. In every other way, he resembled Remus more than the other werewolves. He wasn't particularly tall, and for someone who lived in the forest, he was surprisingly well kept. His brown hair and beard were clean and neatly trimmed. He didn't seem surprised to see Remus, as though the werewolf camp was a place he visited regularly. He peeked into the sack and gave a low whistle. "What's the occasion?" "A gesture of goodwill," Remus replied. The werewolf looked at him, a wicked glint of mischief in his eyes. They were grey and intimidating. "You ought to visit more often, Remus," he said, tossing the sack to one of his companions and leaning lazily against a fallen tree trunk. The other werewolves immediately began squabbling over the treasure. "Greyback asks about you every time he comes. Broke the old man's heart, you did." Sirius didn't let on how much that comment disturbed him. Greyback was the werewolf who had cursed Remus with this fate, but this boy spoke of him as if he were his father. He felt Remus's hand tighten around his wand in his coat pocket and knew that even though his friend remained calm outwardly, he was struggling to keep his emotions in check. Sirius decided to take the lead. "We're here to do business, not for a family reunion," he said in a low voice. "And hooray, you meant to be." But before Sirius could answer, shouting broke out. The werewolves were now fighting over the treasures. Without a word, their young leader charged into the brawl to break it up. "What's his story?" Sirius muttered to Remus, as the young werewolf snatched a trinket from his companion's hands. "That's Vargan," Remus replied grimly. "At the moment, he's Greyback's heir. Unlike me, he chose to join him after being bitten." "That's sick," Sirius said. The scuffle dispersed, and only Vargan remained, examining a golden locket inlaid with green gemstones. Sirius felt an odd, powerful urge to snatch the heirloom from his filthy hands, but forced it down. "What were we talking about?" Vargan asked lightly, slipping the locket around his neck with satisfaction. "Ah, yes, you were just about to tell me who you are, but I think I've already worked it out. You're Sirius Black, aren't you? The infamous mass murderer." "At your service," Sirius replied. "You've outdone yourself this time, Remus," Vargan said, settling himself on the log and watching them like they were part of a show. Regulus's locket glittered on his chest, making it hard for Sirius to focus. "So how exactly do you think you'll convince us not to side with the Dark Lord?" "You should know I wasn't thrilled with the perks," Sirius said, dropping the act of the sinister Sirius and reverting to being himself. Vargan laughed heartily. "I like you," he said. "I'm listening." This was the moment, the one they'd spent over 3 weeks chasing. But Sirius had barely said a few words when the camp erupted into chaos again, even louder this time. "Auras!" someone yelled. and the crackling of apparition began echoing through the trees. "It's a raid," Remus said quickly. "You need to go, Sirius." Sirius stood frozen, unwilling to believe the opportunity had slipped through his fingers. Vargan had already vanished, and with him the locket. The air buzzed with magic as spells zipped through the trees. Werewolves ran in every direction or fought back against the intruders, and the confusion made it impossible to understand what was going on. "Go," Remus shouted, pushing Sirius towards the trees. "Quickly, before they see you." "What about you?" Sirius asked urgently. "They mustn't see you," Remus shouted now. "Go now." Sirius glanced over his shoulder. Figures in dark blue aura robes were moving through the trees. If they caught him, he'd get the Dementor's kiss. And this time, Harry wouldn't be there to save him. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely to his friend. He transformed into a huge black dog and bolted into the forest. But even in his animagus form, the urge not to abandon Remus only grew, and within moments it blossomed into full-blown guilt. He ran until the sounds of battle were distant, then, with a whine, turned and raced back toward the camp. Scenting sweat and blood, Padfoot crept silently through the trees until he saw Remus. His friend was kneeling on the ground with a dozen other werewolves, his hands bound behind his back. Padfoot longed to charge in and help, but the human part of him knew it was hopeless. They had failed. Chapter 27. Making It Through the Night. Tonks was nervous. It wasn't the first time, or even the second, that she'd met with the head of the Aura office. But it was the first time she was going into his office with the intention of lying. "Relax," Raymond told her from the armchair in the waiting room. "It's just a chat. He's not going to fire you." Tonks gave him a faint smile, trying not to show how his attempt at reassurance only made her more anxious. He had no idea how close she was to being fired, or to something worse. One poorly told lie was all that stood between her and a possible future in Azkaban for undermining the Ministry of Magic. The door to Scrimgeour's office opened, and Kingsley's bald head popped out. "We're ready for you, Hawkins," he said to Raymond, who jumped up eagerly and strode inside. Kingsley shut the door behind him, but not before catching Tonks's eye and tapping his own head. She ran a hand through her bubble-gum pink hair, wondering what Kingsley was trying to tell her. "You look good, Tonks." She jumped. Hyde was standing in the doorway of the waiting room. "Oh, thanks," she replied, unsure how to respond. "What are you doing here?" "I've got a meeting with Scrimgeour," he said, sinking gracefully into the armchair Raymond had just vacated. "So do I," Tonks said, trying not to show how uneasy his presence made her. Ever since she'd done his dirty work at the beginning of the summer, tracking down Harry, he'd kept assigning her to his operations, always handing her the most annoying, boring tasks, all while treating her with a strange sort of fondness. She was always on edge around him, never quite knowing what he'd say or do next. Hyde gave her a knowing smile. "What?" she asked irritably. "Nothing," he replied calmly. They waited in awkward silence for several long minutes before Raymond emerged, looking quite pleased with himself. "They told me to fetch you," he said to Tonks, his eyes lingering on her face. "Good luck." "Thanks," Tonks replied uncertainly, brushing past him. To her utter surprise, as she entered the head's office, Hyde followed her in. But before she could ask what the hell he was doing, Scrimgeour spoke. "Ora Tonks," he said sternly, "please sit down." Tonks sat in the chair opposite Scrimgeour's desk while he leafed through a stack of papers. Hyde took a seat in the corner of the room. Tonks glanced at Kingsley, only to find him trying urgently to communicate something to her without speaking. She couldn't make out what he was trying to say. "Well, I see you're as colorful as ever, Ora Tonks," Scrimgeour said suddenly, with a hint of disapproval. And Tonks understood. He meant the hair. "I apologize, sir," she said, feeling her cheeks flush. "I was caught up in work and—" "Let's begin," he cut her off. "Do you know why you're here?" "You wanted to speak with me," Tonks replied, feigning slight confusion. Sir, do you know what about? No, she lied. Scrimgeour hummed indifferently. If he knew how long she'd practiced saying that no in the mirror, he might have been a little more impressed. I'm sure you've heard about the stir Dumbledore caused at the start of the summer, claiming that he, who must not be named, has returned, he said smoothly. By order of the Minister for Magic, every department head is to interview their staff and determine whether they have any ties to Dumbledore or his allies. Tonks nodded in empty understanding. Scrimgeour launched into a series of questions about her personal life, where she lived and with whom, who her friends at the office were, how she spent her time outside of work. She answered honestly, omitting only her urgent visits to Grimmauld Place and order duties. Very well, Scrimgeour said tonelessly, scribbling something on the parchment before him. Tonks tried to see what he was writing, but couldn't. Everything seems in order. There's just one last matter. Tonks looked at him expectantly, desperate to leave and put this stressful ordeal behind her. I've been promising you a promotion for some time, Scrimgeour said, finally meeting her eyes. So I'm promoting you to the special unit, effective immediately. Tonks was so shocked she didn't say anything. She looked at Kingsley and saw that he too seemed stunned by the development. I wasn't made aware of this, sir, he said to the department head. It was a last-minute decision, Scrimgeour replied, looking at Tonks. From now on, Aura Hyde will be your supervisor. She looked over her shoulder. Hyde was sitting comfortably in the corner, looking pleased. I'm very much looking forward to working with you, Aura Tonks, he said, in a tone that could easily be mistaken for mockery. Tonks forced herself to shake off the shock. Thank you, sir, she said to Scrimgeour with forced enthusiasm. She had to play the part. This was a tremendous opportunity for an aura of her standing, and she couldn't risk seeming to question the reason behind her promotion. You won't regret it. Scrimgeour dismissed her. Grab your things and come down to the unit. We'll find you a desk, Hyde said before leaving. She exited the waiting room and walked slowly until Kingsley caught up with her. What's going on? She asked him immediately. I think he suspects us, Kingsley said in a low voice. But he has no way to prove it, so he's using divide-and-conquer tactics. We need to report to Dumbledore. From now on, we can't be seen together. Do you understand? Tonks nodded, her heart tightening with a twinge of sadness. I'll miss working with you, she whispered before they entered the office. So will I, he replied softly, and they parted ways. Tonks returned to her tiny office and began packing her desk into a crate. Going somewhere? Raymond asked her. I've been transferred, she said glumly, tossing a small unicorn figurine into the box. Oh, sorry to hear that, Raymond said, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. Tonks hadn't told him it was actually a promotion. She finished loading the crate and levitated it toward the offices of the special unit. She knew she was meant to be happy about the promotion. The special unit was every young aura's dream, but she couldn't feel it. She couldn't shake the feeling that if Scrimgeour hadn't suspected her, she'd never have been given this chance. The offices were empty. For a brief moment, she examined the wanted posters and maps on the walls before realizing everyone was in the adjacent briefing room. A wave of noise crashed over her as she entered. A dozen auras were standing about and chatting, and those nearest the door turned to look at her. She seemed to be the only witch there. Feeling slightly intimidated, she left her crate outside and went in to look for Hyde. She found him at the back of the room, leaning over a huge map beside an older aura. As soon as she approached, he looked up and gave her a smug smile. Who'd have thought you would be the friendly face here? Your desk will have to wait. We've got a raid, he said. Where? Tonks asked, slightly surprised to be included in a raid on her very first day. Galloway, Scotland, Hyde replied. The other aura acted as though Tonks didn't exist. We've received intel that a dangerous group of werewolves are in the area, Greyback's lot. Who's Greyback? Tonks pretended not to know. to hide the fact that greyback had been discussed on an almost weekly basis at the Order meetings. Only the most notorious werewolf of the past 30 years, Hyde's companion said disdainfully, still not bothering to introduce himself. Anyway, there's a full moon tonight, Hyde went on, and they do love biting people on a full moon. Go get kitted up. We leave in 10 minutes. Tonks nodded and turned to go, but suddenly froze. Questions? Hyde asked. No, she replied with forced casualness, and left the briefing room. Galloway Forest, that was where Remus and Sirius had gone. It was a vast area, but still. What if they were with those werewolves now? What if they were there when the Auras arrived? What would happen to Sirius? For a moment, she was about to run and find Kingsley, but at the last second restrained herself and headed to the equipment room. There was no way to get a message to Remus and Sirius. The only communication from them over the past fortnight had come from their side. No one in the Order could pinpoint their exact location deep in the forest, not even Dumbledore. And besides, she wasn't supposed to contact Kingsley anymore. She was on her own. Guilt and fear washed over her as she geared up. Protective gear, lie detectors, antidotes. She was the only one who could help Remus and Sirius now, and yet there was nothing she could do but stand by and watch. She pulled on her dueling gloves, a graduation gift from her father, and her heart clenched. What was the point of belonging to a secret resistance if she couldn't do anything to change what was about to happen? The portkey from the ministry transported the Auras straight into the heart of the forest. Tonks was jostled between the Auras on either side of her as they whirled through that tight, blindingly bright vortex, and the moment her feet touched the ground she tumbled into a pile of autumn leaves. She sprang to her feet at once, dizzy and disoriented, and found the raid already in full swing. The Auras were spreading out among the trees, cursing and stunning werewolves who were fleeing or fighting back. She was lost in the chaos, realizing she didn't know what she was meant to do. She had never taken part in a raid like this before. She spun in place. They seemed to be managing just fine without her. But as the thought crossed her mind, she spotted someone between the trees, someone fleeing the scene. Tonks gave chase. He was fast, clearly familiar with the forest terrain, while she struggled to navigate the dense trees. She tried to stun him, but her spells hit Bark instead. In one last, desperate attempt to avoid a complete failure, she apparated, aiming to appear right in front of the target. But the momentum of her run caught up with her mid-apparation, slamming her into a tree trunk the moment she materialized. Someone laughed. The target, a man about Tonks's age, had stopped running to mark her bold attempt. She reached for her wand, only to realize she dropped it when she'd been thrown, and now it was in the werewolf's hand. She straightened against the tree trunk, tense, but didn't have time to even think about escaping before he seized her throat with one hand and hauled her upright with inhuman strength. His eyes were pale and cruel, his sharp yellow teeth jarringly at odds with his otherwise handsome face. Fear trickled down her back like icy water. "Nice hair," he sneered. In a frantic bid to break free, Tonks aimed a sharp kick at his stomach. He grunted in surprise and pain, clearly not expecting such a blow from someone so small. She used the opening to snatch her wand from his hand and stun him. He collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, a mask of frozen fury on his face. Tonks rubbed her throat and tried to steady her breathing. The sounds of fighting that had echoed through the trees earlier had now fallen silent. She knew the raid was over. She cast a stretcher spell on the werewolf and levitated him back with her, hovering before her like a murderous marionette. A heavy golden pendant swung from his neck like a guillotine. The Auras were gathering the captured werewolves in a clearing between the trees, where they knelt in a long, orderly row, hands bound behind their backs. Many had resisted and been stunned without ceremony, but a few knelt in silence, resigned to their fate. Among them knelt Remus, his gaze fixed on the ground. Tonks's eyes were drawn to him instantly, like a magnet, and she recognized him immediately. even though a beard covered his face and unkempt hair obscured his eyes. "You all right?" one of the auras asked her brightly, and a few of his mates looked over with a hint of mockery. Realizing they were mistaking her pallor and expression of despair for the shock of an inexperienced recruit, she dropped the werewolf she had caught and said in a steady voice, "I'm perfectly fine." Remus looked up at the sound of her voice. A flicker of hope passed through his otherwise hopeless eyes. Tonks's stomach twisted at the sight of his helplessness. "You know him," said Hyde. Tonks looked at him in alarm. She hadn't even noticed he was standing beside her. Was she really that transparent? Was everything she felt and thought written so clearly on her face? A rush of relief washed over her as he added, "He came sniffing around the office a few months ago, remember? You walked him out." "You're right," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. "Nice to see you again, Mr. Lupin," Hyde said with a smirk, and Remus dropped his gaze and stayed silent. "Since you love spending time at the ministry so much, I'm sure you'll be thrilled to hear you'll be spending the night there. Come on, Tonks, I want you to handle the arrest paperwork." Tonks answered obediently without thinking, tearing her eyes away from Remus and following her new superior. Thus began the worst night of her life. The auras brought the werewolves back to the ministry, where they spent the rest of the day awaiting processing. Due to a shortage of space, they were seated on two benches in a damp, gloomy stone corridor leading to the 8th floor holding cells, their hands bound to enchanted metal rings embedded in the walls. Their anger had dulled after hours of waiting, replaced by boredom and restlessness. They shouted across to one another, laughed raucously, and traded crude jokes. Remus was the only one who sat in complete silence, and Tonks couldn't help but admire his composure in such circumstances. Her own situation wasn't much better. Hyde ordered her to handle the pre-processing, while he and the rest of the team relaxed in the office. She had to fetch the files of each detainee from the archives and conduct a search on them before they were put into the cells for the full moon. She'd been through plenty of unpleasant experiences in her job and at the academy, but they all paled in comparison to what she endured that afternoon. The werewolves were brought one by one into a side room, where a slightly more experienced aura skimmed their files while Tonks checked them for weapons and stolen goods. Saying that none of them took it like a gentleman was a gross understatement. Remus was among the last. Tears of relief threatened to well in her eyes when another aura shoved him in roughly. He looked at her with guilt, then dropped his gaze. "Remus Lupin," the other aura read aloud, scanning the single slip of parchment that made up Remus's record. "No prior offenses, no violent history. Well, there's always a first time. Stand in the middle and spread your arms. No funny business." Remus obeyed in silence. Tonks's hands trembled as she patted down his pockets and coat, not daring to make eye contact, terrified she'd give herself away. Her heart skipped when she felt his wand tucked inside his inner coat pocket. Praying the other aura hadn't noticed, she pretended not to feel a thing. "My wand is in the inner pocket of my coat," Remus said quietly. Tonks looked at him in shock. The other aura leapt up, triumphant. "A wand, is it?" he said, shoving his hand into the pocket and pulling it out. "And who'd you nick this from?" "It's mine, registered to me," Remus replied calmly. "I'm a Hogwarts graduate. It's in my file." The aura snorted skeptically. "We'll check," he said, and left through the other door without another word to Tonks. "I'll get you out," she whispered to Remus as soon as the footsteps faded. "No, you won't," he said firmly. "No," she echoed in disbelief. "You're not like them. You shouldn't be here." "It doesn't matter," he said in a very low voice, glancing at the doors. "A ministry aura helping a filthy werewolf out of the goodness of her heart, that's going to raise eyebrows. You can't risk it. You'll lose your job, or worse. They'll throw you in a cell. They'll want to know what I was doing with that group in the forest. Better they think I joined them than risk the mission." When Tonks still looked unconvinced, he met her gaze and said, "If you won't do it for me, do it for the Order." Tonks's throat tightened with emotion. The look in his eyes made her tremble. Footsteps outside. She summoned the last of her self-control and adopted a professional expression. "Seems like he's telling the truth," the second aura said grudgingly, as though Remus's honesty somehow insulted him. "Like I said, always a first time. Finish searching him and move on. We need to be done before nightfall." The last werewolf brought into the room was the young one Tonks had captured in the forest. A cruel grin spread across his face when he saw her standing there, exhausted. "I was wondering when I'd see you again," he said sweetly, as she rifled through his pockets. "Shut it," Tonks muttered, shaking out his coat. He ignored her. "You got me good out there in the woods. You're a fighter, not like other human girls. Sure you don't have wolf blood in you." He laughed and jabbed a finger at the left side of her chest. A wave of uncharacteristic revulsion and fury surged through her, and she slapped his hand away and stunned him for the second time that day. "Good call," the other aura said. Tonks continued the search, feeling an overwhelming urge to vomit. Why did she deserve this? She found nothing in his pockets. The only item he carried besides his clothes was a heavy gold chain from which hung a round, ancient-looking pendant. "Must be stolen," the aura said as Tonks placed it in the box, where it gleamed atop a pile of mundane items, along with Remus's wand. He stared at it intently, and by the time Tonks had removed the werewolf from the room and returned with a sense of relief, he was holding it up to the light. She picked up the box and gestured for him to return the pendant. "What?" he asked, suddenly irritable. "It needs to be included as evidence," she replied in the same tone. After the day she'd had, she didn't have the patience to be polite. "Unless you'd rather do it yourself." The aura's irritation faded into confusion. He stared at the pendant oddly, then set it back in the box. Tonks carried the box to the office, her legs heavy with despair and guilt. It was already late evening. Most of the ministry workers had gone home, leaving only a few diligent staff and the night shift auras. Remus's wand was just sitting there. She was alone in the lift, completely alone. She could slip it into her pocket and no one would know, but the memory of the look in Remus's eyes burned her like hot iron. Maybe she should listen to him, just make it through the night. When the lift doors opened, she nearly walked straight into Hyde. He was in the corridor, talking with Scrimgeour and none other than the Minister for Magic himself. All three turned to look at her as she stepped out. "Aura Tonks," said Scrimgeour, "how are you finding the special unit so far?" "It's a nightmare." "It's a tremendous opportunity, sir," she recited wearily. "Tonks has been working hard today," Hyde told them proudly, as if she were his own creation. "We brought in a large group of werewolves today, Minister. Preventative detention." "Well done," said Fudge stiffly, nodding at the auras with satisfaction. The smug smile on his sagging face made Tonks feel sick. He wouldn't be smiling like that if he'd had to search 13 filthy werewolves and Remus. "Are these their belongings?" Hyde asked, peering into the box. She had the sense he was trying to appear professional in front of Scrimgeour and Fudge. If they weren't there, he wouldn't have cared about the items at all. "What's this? Where'd they steal it from?" He picked up the pendant and examined it closely, running his thumb over the green gems with a captivated expression. "Looks valuable. No doubt they pinched it from some respectable wizarding household," Fudge said. "No doubt," echoed Scrimgeour. Tonks wondered if she was the only one who noticed how Hyde's curiosity shifted into something more like entranced affection. "Sir," she asked him cautiously. Hyde snapped out of it and smiled at her. "I'll take this from you," he said, grabbing the box from her hands. "It's nearly night. I want you on detention duty. Good experience." "Of course," Tonks replied with a false smile, nodded to Fudge and Scrimgeour, and left the way she came. She had never felt so alienated or disgusted by the people around her. From there, the night only got worse. Tonks went down to the 8th floor, where the supervising aura ordered the prisoners to be placed in pairs. as there weren't enough cells for them all. "There's barely enough space for one person," she protested, looking at the tiny cells embedded in the thick stone walls that formed the foundation of the Ministry of Magic. "They'll kill each other." But her outcry was ignored, and she found herself leading prisoners to the cells with a sense of disgust. Only the disgust wasn't directed at them, it was directed at herself. She wanted to scream, to declare that she wouldn't take part in this, not even to keep her job. But she didn't. She kept doing her duty, trying to convince herself that rebellion wouldn't help, even though it felt like she was rotting from the inside. The werewolves laughed and chatted loudly with one another, letting out wolfish howls as the auras led them to the cells where they would spend their transformation. The only ones who didn't behave that way were Remus and the werewolf Tonks had caught in the forest, who were assigned to the same cell. Remus let her lead him without protest, head bowed. Tonks wondered tensely if he was afraid because he didn't show it. He looked guilty. In contrast, the werewolf whose name she didn't know walked with his head held high, flashing affectionate smiles at his companions, unconcerned by the wand Tonks was aiming at his back. "Very considerate of you to put me and Remus in the same room," he said cheerfully over his shoulder. "We're brothers, you know." "We're not," Remus growled before Tonks even had a chance to react. "The same magic flows through our veins, the same blood made us what we are. What would you call that, if not family?" "We're not family," Remus repeated in a dangerous tone Tonks had never heard from him before. "Whatever you say," the werewolf replied, glancing at Tonks again. "She'd be a nice addition to the family, wouldn't she?" Again, Remus reacted before Tonks could respond. He yanked hard against the enchanted rope binding his hands and lunged at the other werewolf. At first, she thought he was just trying to frighten him, but she quickly realized he truly meant to hurt him. "Enough," she shouted, blasting them apart with a jinx and stepping between them. "That's enough." She looked at Remus. He met her gaze, his face flushed deep red with rage beneath his beard. The other werewolf chuckled, licking a cut on his lower lip. "Oh, I see what's going on here." A shiver crawled up Tonks's spine. "Get in," she said tightly, shoving him towards the cell. He walked in without resistance, still laughing. Remus followed obediently, his eyes once again lowered. Tonks's stomach twisted in pain as she closed and locked the iron door. "You did good there, breaking them up," the supervising aura told her. On any other day, she would have been proud to receive praise from a senior officer, but now it only made her hate herself even more. "It's about to begin," the supervisor called out to the other auras on shift. "Sit back and enjoy the show, lads." There were no windows on the 8th floor, but there was no mistaking the moment the moon began to rise. It started with growls that quickly turned to shouts and screams. Tonks stood frozen in terror as the screams grew louder, morphing into howls and animalistic shrieks. The iron doors trembled with deafening force, but even that couldn't muffle the violent sounds of the fights erupting behind them. Without stopping to wonder what the other auras might think, Tonks turned and ran. She burst into the nearest bathroom and began to vomit. She didn't know how long she stayed there, perhaps all night. Once she'd thrown up the little food she'd managed to eat that day, the tears came and she couldn't stop them. It felt like all the fear, humiliation, revulsion, and guilt that had built up inside her throughout this never-ending day had nowhere else to go. Sobs racked her body, and she felt like she might break apart at any moment. No one had told her this was what she'd have to do, what she'd have to become. No one at the academy had said she might one day have to lock up one of her closest friends in a tiny cell with a werewolf, then return in the morning to drag him out in pieces. And what if Remus didn't survive the night? What would she say to Sirius, to Lily and James? What would she say to the kids, the students who had loved and adored him? Did he have any relatives? A mum and dad? Siblings? She didn't know. She was beginning to realize just how little she actually knew about Remus, and that she might never get the chance to truly know him. Eventually, the tears ran dry, and she forced herself to stand. She went to the sink to wash her face and recoiled from her reflection in the mirror. Her face was as pale as chalk, her eyes bloodshot and red-rimmed. The pink had vanished from her hair, leaving it limp and mousy brown. She tried, and failed, to restore her usual appearance. That tended to happen when she was especially upset. "To hell with it," she muttered, and dunked her head under the running water. Toward morning, the noises began to fade, and by sunrise, a deep silence had settled over the holding cells. Tonks stood behind the other auras, trembling after a sleepless night. She knew she looked awful. The others were giving her looks of pity and disgust, but she no longer cared. When the order came to open the cells, she forced herself not to close her eyes. There was no movement inside, even once the doors were unlocked. But when they opened the cell where Remus had been, they found him standing at the entrance, waiting. Tonks stared as he stepped forward, holding out his arms to be bound and taken away. It was hard to tell how badly injured he was with all the blood staining his torn clothes. As the other auras led him out, he made an impressive effort not to limp and didn't look at Tonks as he passed her. The moment her shift ended, she left the ministry without saying a word to anyone, not even considering staying to finish the paperwork for extra credit. She apparated to her flat, then immediately apparated again, this time to Grimmauld Place. She appeared in a side alley and turned towards the house's facade, not even thinking about the fact that it was the middle of the day, in the middle of a Muggle street, and she was wearing wizarding robes. She bounded up the steps and pounded her fists on the black door. After several moments of frantic banging, the door swung open. James stood behind it, looking stunned by the sight of her. "Where is he?" she demanded, pushing past him without pleasantries. "Remus," James asked, confused. "He's in the drawing room. Are you all right, Tonks?" She was already halfway to the drawing room and didn't answer. The first thing she noticed when she entered was Sirius, standing with his back to the empty fireplace, and for the first time since the raid, she realized she hadn't spared a single thought that morning for what had happened to him. Then she saw Remus. He was sitting on the sofa, dressed in clean clothes, free of blood, his wounds bandaged. A thick dressing peeked from under his shirt, wrapped around his chest, and 3 fresh gashes stretched from his forehead down his nose to his left cheek. He had even managed to shave since the end of her shift, and now looked far more like the Remus she knew from before that night. He even smiled at her, an encouraging, slightly pained smile. "You should have seen the other bloke," he said, trying to joke about the severity of his injuries. She opened her mouth, but all the things she'd meant to say vanished from her mind. She'd planned to shout at him, to say she could have helped if he'd only let her, that he was an idiot who had to play the hero, but the words wouldn't come. In the end, all she could say was, "I thought you were going to die in there." Tears threatened to return, so she was especially grateful when James said softly, "We'll leave you 2 alone. Come on, Padfoot." The moment the door closed, she collapsed onto a nearby sofa, buried her face in her hands, and surrendered to silent sobs. "Nymphadora," Remus began softly. "Don't call me that," she mumbled through her fingers. Remus chuckled. "At least you're still you, but you have to understand, I've been going through these transformations since I was a very small child, and I'll keep going through them. So you don't need to be afraid for me. You saw I can take care of myself." Tonks smiled in spite of herself, through her tears. "You really gave him a thrashing." Remus laughed bashfully. When she opened her eyes, she saw he was blushing. "He deserved it," he said modestly. Something twisted inside her. "He figured us out," she said, trying to push the feeling away, telling herself she was imagining it from exhaustion. "He knew we knew each other." "Don't worry about that," Remus said at once. "I'll handle him." That feeling again. She leaned back and tried to take a deep breath, but it only brought the tears back. She covered her face and wept silently until she felt the sofa shift beside her. Remus gently pulled her into a hug, and her tears soaked into his clean shirt. He didn't smell like blood or sweat or the holding cells. He smelled like himself, and she found that comforting. "How do you do it?" she asked against his shoulder. "How do you go through that hell again and again?" Remus buried his nose in her horrible mousy hair and didn't answer. But she didn't have time to ask again. She was already fast asleep. Chapter 28. Wrong Place, Wrong Time. After only 6 weeks at Hogwarts, the school had already exceeded all of Emily's expectations. In the first few days, she still had to pinch herself as she lay in her four-poster bed in Gryffindor Tower in the morning light, just to remind herself she wasn't dreaming. The scattered mists of early autumn gave way to nightly thunderstorms, with lightning flashing on the horizon and illuminating the forest in an eerie glow, and thunder shaking the towers with its force. But by day, the sun still shone through the clouds, streaming into the great hall like a spotlight at lunch, and turning the dust motes swirling in the classrooms and library to gold. Between lessons and homework, the autumn days passed in a blur, and Emily was so busy that she even stopped noticing the strange looks she sometimes got in the corridors. They became part of the scenery. Her favorite subject, shared by most of the other first years, was defense against the dark arts. Instead of memorizing complicated incantations like in Transfiguration, or pronouncing long, tricky words like in Charms, they would spread out around the classroom practicing simple, useful spells under the supervision of Emily's mother. Emily wasn't top of the class, but at least her magical outbursts were looked upon more kindly here than in Professor McGonagall's strict and crowded lessons. Twice a week, Emily and her fellow first-years left the castle and crossed the lawns to the greenhouses, where they learned about magical plants from Professor Sprout. One night a week, they climbed the astronomy tower to observe the stars through their telescopes. History of magic was taught by a ghost with a screechy, monotonous voice so dull that even though Emily was eager to learn about the history of the wizarding world, she could hardly keep her eyes open for more than 5 minutes. The more she learned, the more she realized just how little she truly knew about the magical world, and how much practice it took to master magic. The subject Emily excelled at most was potions. During the first lesson, as she took her place beside Margaret and Jenna in the cool, dimly lit dungeon classroom, she was filled with apprehension. There were many rumors about Professor Snape's cruelty, especially towards Gryffindor students. Emily hoped he might go easy on her, since he was, or used to be, a friend of her mother's. But the moment he swept into the room and began teaching, she realized he wasn't the kind of teacher who handed out favors. For the entire first hour, Professor Snape lectured them on the complexity and importance of potion making. He spoke in a deep, flat tone, and the students' attention quickly began to wane. Next to Emily, Jenna rested her head on her hand, and it seemed only the fear of Snape's presence kept her from dozing off. But Emily wasn't bored. She sat on the edge of her chair, listening intently as Professor Snape described the near-endless possibilities of magical potions. It reminded her of science lessons at her old school, but far more magical and fascinating. She fell in love with the subject at once. The potion's master spoke of brews where a single drop could kill, but also of those that could cure the most dreadful illnesses. Potions that could make someone look like someone else, induce deep sleep or prolonged wakefulness, levitation potions, luck potions, love potions, and even one that could enhance one's ability to predict the future. A witch or wizard could brew all these potions without even raising a wand. All that was needed was concentration, planning, and precision. After the lecture, Emily and her classmates set to work on brewing their first potion, a wort-curing concoction. She read the instructions in her textbook with great care before beginning. There were only 4 ingredients, but Professor Snape warned them that the slightest deviation from the proper order of preparation could lead to unexpected and even dangerous results. Still keeping one eye on her book, Emily placed her new cauldron over the flame and began to slowly grind up snake fangs. She had barely finished when there was a loudpapand, a burst of smoke, and sparks from Jenna's cauldron. Winterbottom, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Snape said as she coughed and wiped soot from her face, peering at the attendance list. Tell me, can you read? Jenna stammered, uncertainly. If you could read, he continued, you would have noticed that the ginger root is to be added after stirring, not before. I'm sorry, Jenna said. The whole class was staring at her, and her cheeks turned as red as a tomato. It's not me you should apologize to, said Professor Snape, moving along. 5 points from Gryffindor. Jenna's mouth dropped open in shock. For a moment it looked like she might argue, but Margaret nudged her and gave her a look to let it go. Emily turned her attention back to her own potion. She was beginning to understand why Harry and his friends had disliked Snape so much. 10 minutes before the end of the lesson, Professor Snape told them to stop working. He moved between the tables, inspecting their work, occasionally making mocking remarks about the potion's quality. Jenna's potion had turned a deep green, far from the pearly hue it was supposed to have. Margaret's was closer in color, but produced so much smoke that it filled the dungeon and had everyone coughing. Snape passed both girls with an expression of disdain, not even bothering to examine their work properly. When he reached Emily's cauldron, he paused. He dipped a ladle into the potion and inspected the thick, whitish liquid critically. Emily rocked nervously on her heels. At last, he gave a slight nod and moved on. Margaret and Jenna stared at the scene in astonishment. Emily's success in potions continued to grow until she became something of a legend among the first years. There didn't seem to be a potion she couldn't brew properly. Her talent became so well known that Connor Lawrie, one of the Muggle-born Gryffindor boys, affectionately started calling her the Cauldron Whisperer. But not all the nicknames were kind. Some students believed she received special treatment because her mother was a Hogwarts teacher, or because her surname happened to be Potter. In the first week of October, Bridget stopped saying hello to her in the corridors between classes, though Emily didn't know whether it was because she'd outperformed her in a lesson, or if it was just Bridget being Bridget. They're just jealous, Margaret told her whenever first years from other houses whispered as they passed, and Emily thought she might be right. Potions was difficult even without Snape's snide remarks, and she seemed to be the only student outside Slytherin who wasn't treated with obvious disdain by the potions master. In the third week of term, while they were brewing a hair-lengthening potion, Professor Snape told her she'd done a good job. He never praised students, not even those in his own house. But the real highlight came in the second week of October, when he awarded Gryffindor 5 points for the flawless slug-repelling potion she had brewed. The news of her rare achievement spread quickly through the school, and by lunchtime that same day, she was practically famous. Snape never gives points to Gryffindor, Ginny told her in awe when they met in the Great Hall. Not even Hermione. How did you do it? Emily blushed and didn't know what to say. She tried to explain that she hadn't done anything special, that she just brewed the potion the way Snape had instructed, but people insisted on thinking she had some magical gift. The idea troubled her for the rest of the day. She couldn't stop wondering whether she was good at potions because she was truly talented, or because she had a prior connection with Professor Snape. True, it wasn't like they'd ever really spoken, but still, Snape had been a regular guest in her parents' home before the truth came out. She remembered him sitting stiffly on their sofa in their home in Washington, always in some dark suit and tie, sipping coffee while listening to Lily talk. He'd bring Emily presents, children's books and toys that never quite matched her age. She'd accept them and thank him like her mum had taught her, and he'd nod and go back to pretending she wasn't there. It was hard to connect that man with the stern potions master, but they were the same person. Were the 5 points he gave her just another strange attempt to show affection, like the ill-fitting gifts of the past? By evening, the thought bothered her so much that she couldn't concentrate on her homework. Margaret sat beside her, immersed in a long essay for her biology. Jenna was across the common room with Billy, Connor, and a few second years gathered suspiciously around Fred and George. "Where are you going?" Margaret asked as Emily stood up and packed her things. To see my mum, Emily replied. She wanted to talk to someone about Professor Snape, but didn't think her friends would understand. I'll be back later. She slipped out through the portrait hole just as the group around Fred and George began collapsing, one by one, in dramatic swoons. Hermione's scolding echoed faintly behind her as the portrait closed and the noise ceased. Emily wandered the dim corridors towards her mother's office, uncertain of the way. She'd only been there once since the start of term, and by torchlight, all the corridors looked the same. Eventually, with some guidance from nearly headless Nick and an unpleasant encounter with Peeves, who pelted her with chalk until she ran around the corner, she reached Professor Potter's office. She knocked on the heavy oak door. There was no answer, but she was certain she saw someone moving inside. A shadow was moving across the floor, visible in the crack under the door. She immediately remembered that evening in Grimmauld Place, when she'd overheard her parents arguing, and a sense of dread settled in her chest. They'd since made peace and things had returned to normal, but Emily didn't want to witness another fight. She turned and walked away. Maybe it was silly to go looking for her mum just because she was feeling a little insecure. She should learn to deal with it on her own, like the other kids whose parents didn't teach at Hogwarts. Maybe she'd ask Harry to borrow Hedwig and write to her dad instead. Maybe. She turned a corner and collided hard with someone. Oof, cried Bridget, stumbling back. She looked at Emily accusingly. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? Emily shot back. I don't have time for this, Bridget said shortly. Have you seen anyone come this way? No, said Emily, confused. Bridget muttered something and dashed off in the direction Emily had just come from. Where are you going? Emily called after her. When she didn't answer, Emily broke into a run and followed. Why are you running? Bridget didn't reply. They raced along the corridor, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. At the corridor's end, Bridget looked left and right and screamed. Emily skidded to a stop beside her in confusion and alarm. Sprawled on the floor was a girl. She was not there a few minutes before. Bridget ran to her immediately and kneeled beside her. Emily ran right after her. It was an older Ravenclaw student with almond-shaped eyes and short black hair. Her skin was pale as snow, and she appeared unconscious. The front of her robe was torn and singed, indicating that she had not just passed out spontaneously. For some reason, Bridget was fiddling with her own book bag instead of helping, so Emily pressed 2 fingers to the girl's neck, just as they'd learned in first aid at her old school, and found a pulse. Go get help, she said to Bridget, who was now staring at the unconscious girl with wide eyes. At the sound of Emily's voice, she jumped and ran off. Emily turned her attention back to the girl. Other than the torn robe, she didn't seem to be injured. She looked around for clues as to what had happened, and then it dawned on her that whoever had done this might still be nearby. She quickly drew her wand, fear clenching in her chest. The torches flickered against the walls, casting shadows over the marble floor and the suits of armor. Everything wastuqueert. Is someone there? Emily called, her voice trembling. There was no reply. A noise sounded behind her, and she jumped, then relaxed as Bridget appeared around the corner, Professor McGonagall close behind. The Transfiguration teacher, who was always calm and composed, said nothing at the sight of the floating girl, but her eyes flashed and her lips tightened. Wait in my office, she ordered. With a wave of her wand, the unconscious girl floated gently into a lying position, and Professor McGonagall led her away towards the hospital wing. Emily and Bridget walked to McGonagall's office in silence, where they waited for a long time. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the poor girl. Why would anyone do something like that? Was it some kind of prank gone wrong? You had been following her, she said to Bridget after a long pause. Why? She was acting strangely, Bridget replied innocently. I wanted to make sure she was all right. Emily wondered if Bridget seriously expected her to believe that terrible excuse. When the door opened and Professor McGonagall returned, Professor Snape and Professor Dumbledore in tow. The moment she saw the headmaster, Bridget jumped to her feet in awe. "Will she be all right?" Emily asked immediately. "Miss Chang has suffered a traumatic experience, but she is in good hands," Dumbledore replied calmly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Emily looked at Bridget, but she didn't seem inclined to speak. "We found her like that, Professor," Emily said for both of them. "Did you see anyone else nearby?" Emily shook her head. Bridget remained silent. "What were you doing here at this hour?" McGonagall asked, hands on hips. "Why weren't you in your common rooms?" "It's not lights out yet," Bridget defended herself quickly. "You're not in trouble," Dumbledore assured them. "We simply wish to understand what happened tonight." Bridget went silent again. Dumbledore's bright eyes moved over to Emily and came to rest there. "I went to visit my mum in her office," she said. To her surprise, Professor Snape said, "Professor Potter returned home for the rest of the evening. She left Hogwarts before dinner. How could you have visited her?" Emily was caught off balance. "Well, I didn't actually see her. I mean, I knocked on the door and there was no answer. But someone was there. I saw something move inside, I'm sure of it." The teachers exchanged glances. Then, without a word, they left the office. Emily and Bridget hurried after them. Dumbledore led them through the corridors at a brisk pace. They passed the place where Emily and Bridget had found the girl and soon arrived at the Defense Against the Dark Arts office. Dumbledore pointed his wand at the door, and it opened without resistance. Emily peeked inside over Professor Snape's cloak and was shocked. Her mother's office looked as if a hurricane had torn through it. The books that had once been neatly arranged on the shelves were strewn across the floor. All the drawers were open with their contents spilled out, and even the cloak cupboard had been emptied. Dumbledore sighed, lifting a vandalized spellbook with a hint of sorrow. "Just as I feared," he said. "Severus, would you be so kind as to escort Miss Doyle and Miss Potter to their common rooms? The attacker may still be nearby." Professor Snape nodded and turned, ushering Emily and Bridget out and closing the door behind him. "But," Bridget began. "Unless you'd like to help search for the attacker," Professor Snape cut her off, "and amaze them with your dueling skills, I'd suggest you start walking." Bridget obeyed in silence. The corridors, previously deserted, were now almost bustling. As they made their way to the Ravenclaw common room, they passed alert teachers and ghosts searching for the culprit. Emily knew she should have been afraid after what had happened, but she felt safe in Professor Snape's company. The Ravenclaw common room stood at the top of a narrow, winding staircase. Bridget stopped in front of the wooden door, which was perfectly smooth save for a knocker shaped like an eagle's head, and turned to Professor Snape with clenched fists. "Who could have done something like this?" she demanded, clearly trying to keep up a brave front. "Death Eaters," Emily said at once. While waiting in Professor McGonagall's office, she'd recalled stories of Voldemort's followers who had done dreadful things at his command. "There aren't any Death Eaters anymore," Bridget shot back. "There are two," Emily said fiercely. "My brother." "Silence," Professor Snape ordered. Emily fell quiet. "Get inside," he instructed Bridget. For a moment, it looked like she would argue. She opened her mouth as if to say something to Snape, but in the end said nothing. She gave Emily a strange look and entered the common room reluctantly. As soon as the door closed behind her, Professor Snape turned and descended the stairs. Emily hurried after him. "She knows something she's not telling," she said. "She followed that girl. When I met her, she asked me if I'd seen her." Professor Snape didn't reply. He strode quickly towards the Gryffindor common room, and Emily had to break into a jog every few moments to keep up. "Did you hear me?" she asked him. "You'll address me as Professor or Sir," Snape replied coolly. "Right, I know," Emily stammered, embarrassed. "Sorry, sir, but it really was Death Eaters, wasn't it, whoever attacked that girl?" "No," Snape answered. "No," Emily echoed in confusion. Then who was it? Snape didn't respond. They passed Professor Sinistra, who taught astronomy, and she nodded at him formally. Only once she had gone did he say quietly, "Death Eaters can't simply waltz into the school. Besides, they would have done far worse to Miss Chang." So it was someone inside Hogwarts? Emily asked quickly. They were nearly at the common room, and she wanted answers. "Possibly," Snape replied. "Who do you think it was?" Emily pressed. "Sir." She expected Snape to refuse to answer, so she was surprised when he said, "Someone from the Ministry of Magic." Emily was too stunned to reply straight away. They had reached the portrait of the fat lady. "Why would they break into my mum's office?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Is it to do with the order?" "Ask your mother tomorrow," Snape replied. "Now go in." "Go to bed, Emily." Emily stopped arguing, though reluctantly. "Ursa Major," she said to the fat lady. The portrait swung open, letting her in. The common room was warm, crowded, and noisy. It seemed all of Gryffindor had gathered there, doing homework, chatting, or playing games. It seems that rumor that the events of the night had not reached them yet. Emily squeezed between the students, looking for a familiar face, someone to tell what had happened. Emily turned towards the voice, and was startled to see Jenna rushing towards her between the tables, streaks of dried blood on her face. "Where have you been?" her friend asked. "Jenna, your nose," Emily said, staring at the ghastly sight. "Oh, that. It's fine now," Jenna said, wiping her face with her robe sleeve. "I tried one of the skiving snack boxes and things got out of hand. But it's all right. Fred and George sorted it out." "Why did you eat it?" Emily asked, genuinely shocked. If she'd learnt one thing over the summer, it was never to eat anything Fred and George gave you. "They're paying me 20 sickles for every snack I try," Jenna replied cheerfully. "Billy and Connor are doing it too. It's a fun way to earn a bit of wizarding money. Anyway, where were you? The funniest thing happened." Emily craned her neck and scanned the common room. Harry had probably gone to Quidditch practice as he wasn't around. She cut Jenna off and said, "Where's Margaret? I have to tell you both something." "I saw her go upstairs a few minutes ago," Jenna replied, puzzled. "What happened?" Emily grabbed her hand and pulled her towards the dormitories. They climbed the spiral staircase and entered the first-year girls' dorm, which belonged solely to the three of them. Margaret was sitting on her bed in her pajamas, a transfiguration textbook open in front of her as she concentrated hard on changing the color of a white feather. Emily motioned for Jenna to sit beside Margaret and immediately launched into a full account of that evening's events, leaving out no detail. She told them what Snape had said, that he believed the Ministry of Magic was behind the break-in, and only then did she realize she shouldn't have said that. Jenna and Margaret didn't know about the order, and if someone from the Ministry had really broken into her mum's office, it must have been to gather information about it. "Why would the Ministry break into Hogwarts?" Margaret said. "And even if they did, I can't believe they would hurt a student. I mean, that has to be what happened to that girl, right? She saw the burglar, so he hexed her." "Yeah," Emily agreed quickly. "That does sound crazy." "Maybe Snape believes in conspiracy theories," Jenna suggested, intrigued. "There must be conspiracy theories in the wizarding world, right?" "What theories?" Margaret asked. Emily hurried to change the subject. "But don't you think it's weird that Bridget wouldn't say why she was there in the first place?" "Totally weird," Jenna said, leaning back on Margaret's bed. "She's weird herself, Bridget." "How's that?" Emily asked. Jenna shrugged. "She's always alone in the library, surrounded by piles of books. No other first-year borrows that many books, and lately she's stopped showing off in class. Didn't you notice?" Emily hadn't paid much attention before, but now that she thought about it, Jenna was right. "It seems like something else is on her mind, something besides school," Margaret said, looking thoughtful. "It must be something big," Jenna said, staring at the ceiling. "What could be more interesting to Bridget than homework?" The next day, everyone was talking about the attack on Cho Chang. To Emily's relief, it seemed no one knew that she and Bridget had been the ones to find her. Also, no one appeared to be talking about the break-in at Professor Potter's office. The first thing Emily did when she entered the great hall for breakfast was look for her mother at the staff table, but she wasn't there. Then she scanned the Gryffindor table and spotted Harry sitting with Ron and Hermione. They seemed deep in conversation, no doubt about recent events. Emily walked towards them, Jenna and Margaret following behind. "I need to tell you something," she said to Harry urgently, "but not here." Harry looked at her uncertainly. "I'll be right back," he told Ron and Hermione, and let Emily, Jenna, and Margaret lead him out of the hall. "New girlfriends, Potter," a bulldog-faced girl sneered as they passed the Slytherin table. Harry ignored her. They left the hall, moving away from the stream of students still heading to breakfast, and turned down a quiet corridor. As soon as they were alone, Emily recounted the events of the night before to Harry. "You found Cho?" Harry asked. That wasn't the detail Emily had expected him to latch onto. "What happened to her? Is she going to be all right?" "I don't know what they did to her or why, but Professor Dumbledore said she will be all right," Emily replied. "But Harry, why would someone do something like that?" "I don't know," Harry said. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think Snape's right. The Ministry's been trying to make me look like a fame-hungry liar since last term, and after everything they've already done, I wouldn't put it past them to break into Hogwarts and attack someone for getting in the way. Look, I've got defense today. I'll ask Mum about it. And if you really think this Bridget girl knows something she's not telling you, ask her." "Couldn't that be dangerous?" Jenna asked. "I doubt she's going to turn into a dragon," Harry said. "She's an 11-year-old girl, not a dark witch. It's probably nothing." "Too bad. That would have been cool," Jenna said dreamily. "Of course you'd think that," Harry muttered bitterly. Emily decided to take Harry's advice and simply ask Bridget what had happened the night before, but she soon discovered that was easier said than done. Bridget seemed determined not to speak to her. In their shared herbology lesson, she stuck to her classmates like glue, and at the end of the lesson, she bolted out of the greenhouse before Emily could try to catch her. During one break, Emily saw her in the corridor, but the moment Bridget spotted her, she actually ran the other way and vanished among the other students. "I wonder what she's hiding," Margaret mused aloud as they stepped into the windy courtyard, bundled tightly in their cloaks and scarves. "Maybe she really does turn into a dragon," Jenna offered hopefully. Bridget was absent from lunch, and dinner as well. Emily returned to the Gryffindor common room after giving up hope of seeing her, wondering what terrible secret she might be hiding. To her surprise, Harry was waiting for her near the entrance to the common room. "We're going to see Mum," he explained when she looked confused to find him leaning against the wall beside the portrait hole. Not for the first time, Emily noticed how bad he was at acting like a proper older brother. "I'll see you two later," she said to Margaret and Jenna. "Wait," said Margaret. "Isn't it dangerous to walk the corridors after what happened yesterday?" "I'll be with Harry," Emily replied with a shrug. The thought of danger hadn't even crossed her mind. "Yeah," Jenna chimed in. "He fought the darkest wizard of all time or whatever, right? He'll probably flatten the attacker if he runs into them." "Let's go," Harry said coolly, ignoring Jenna's remark. Emily offered her friends an apologetic smile and followed her brother through the portrait hole. Just before it closed behind her, she heard Jenna ask Margaret, What did I say?" Harry made sure they were alone in the corridor before rummaging in his bag and pulling out a strange item. To Emily, it looked like an old piece of parchment. He touched the tip of his wand to it and recited, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." Before Emily's eyes, black lines appeared and began to spread across the parchment, forming the pattern of a map. "Our names are on here," Emily said in surprise, pointing to two dots on the map labeled Harry Potter randomly Potter. "It's a map of Hogwarts," Harry said. It shows everyone in the castle. It used to belong to Dad. So you could see the attacker on this? Emily asked, staring at the map in fascination. If they're in the castle, yeah, Harry said. You'll start seeing really weird things if you stare at it too long. Emily didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't ask. They started walking, navigating the corridors with the help of the map. Even that evening, the corridors were full of teachers and prefects on patrol, but they managed to avoid them skillfully with the map. They even saw Ron and Hermione pass by in a nearby corridor, their darts moving tensely, as though they were arguing again. They passed the spot where Emily and Bridget had found Cho the night before, and Harry knocked on the door of their mother's office. This time, the door opened almost immediately, revealing their mother. She looked worried, but smiled warmly the moment she saw them. You don't need to worry about the attacker. Professor Dumbledore is sure they're no longer in the castle, she said as they entered, noticing Harry stowing the map in his bag. I'd rather be careful, he replied with a touch of bitterness. Somehow I always end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Emily spun around to see her father emerging from the adjoining room. She hugged him gladly, realizing how much she'd missed him. What are you doing here? She asked, laughing as he hugged her tightly and lifted her off the floor. Came to make sure you're not getting into trouble, he replied fondly. Professor Dumbledore told us what happened yesterday, Lily said, her tone more serious. Are you all right, Emily? Both her parents looked at her with concern. She nodded quickly. Good, her mother said in relief. Next time you want to visit me, send Harry's owl all right. I don't think there's anything to worry about, Lily, James said. You know, lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place. Besides, whatever they were looking for, they probably didn't find it. Nothing's gone missing. What do you think they were looking for? Harry asked. Something to connect you to the Order. Her parents exchanged glances. Shall I tell them, or will you? James asked, leaning on the mantelpiece. Dumbledore doesn't believe the Ministry knows about the Order, Lily said, settling into an armchair. Of course, Fudge is afraid of anyone who shows the slightest hint of supporting you and Dumbledore, but he has no solid information. We think they were looking for evidence of something else. Fudge probably feels, James added, a flash of anger in his eyes, that it's not enough to go after just you anymore. What do you mean? He's made up some ridiculous story, Lily said calmly, that I'm a dark witch, and that I helped you and Dumbledore invent the whole Voldemort-returning story to gain power and oust him. What? Emily couldn't believe her ears. Harry muttered something rude about Fudge. Harry, Lily said, in mild reproach. Sorry, he said, though he still looked furious. He rubbed his scar. But that's really what he is. You won't hear me argue, James said. In any case, he can say what he likes, but he's got no proof. Did Emily imagine it, or did her mother still look troubled? If there was nothing about it in this morning's paper, they probably haven't found a lie convincing enough yet, Harry said. But why wasn't there anything about the attack on Cho? The last thing the Ministry wants right now is to admit that something's wrong, James said. If the Daily Prophet prints something about it, people will immediately assume that dark magic was involved, and maybe even start believing you and Dumbledore about Voldemort. I don't think Fudge fancies that idea. A somber silence followed his words. No one said it aloud, but Emily felt sure they were all thinking the same thing. It was only going to get worse. For the first time since the night before, when she'd stood in the corridor with Cho Chang's unconscious body, Emily felt afraid. A school shouldn't be a place where people got attacked around the corner. It wasn't a place where she and her brother were supposed to sneak around in secret just to visit their mum. Her parents had warned her the wizarding world held many dangers, but perhaps she hadn't taken them seriously until now. What if it happens again? She broke the silence in a quiet voice. It won't, her father said at once. We'll find whoever did it and whoever sent them. You can't promise that, Harry said darkly. Ginny said something to me, and I think she's right. We need to learn to defend ourselves. The students need to learn to defend themselves. You're right, Lily said. But the defense against the dark arts curriculum is set by the ministry. I can't deviate from it, especially not with Umbridge around. It doesn't have to be part of class, Harry said. Ginny suggested it could be more like a club. You and Ginny spending a lot of time together lately? James asked, with a teasing glint. Harry turned redder than Emily had ever seen him. She's my replacement on the team. We talk sometimes. So what? He snapped. James shrugged, looking smug. I don't think it's a good idea, Harry, Lily said. Umbridge is watching me like a hawk. This is no time to start a dueling club. She'd think I'm trying to train an army. Not a bad idea, actually, James said with a grin. An army of students to bring down the ministry. We could call it Potter's Army. That's not funny, James, his wife scolded. It's a terrible name, Harry said. Maybe Ginny's got a better one, James teased in reply. Harry muttered something that sounded like "shut up" and pretended to be interested in the repaired book display. Then the conversation moved on. Harry and Emily stayed to have tea with their parents, a custom Emily hadn't encountered in the US and still found a bit odd, until the office clock chimed 8 o'clock. Lights out in half an hour, their mother said. You best get back to your common room. Emily, beginning to feel a bit drowsy after the eventful 24 hours, didn't argue. She and Harry said goodbye to their parents and headed off. The lights in the corridors had already dimmed for lights out. Scattered torches burned with a low, gentle flame, casting flickering shadows on the walls and floor. Harry checked the map by wandlight, and Emily yawned. They passed through a hidden door behind a tapestry, climbed a narrow staircase, and reached the 5th floor. Then Harry stopped suddenly. The girl from last night, he said to Emily, studying the map intently. What did you say her name was? Bridget, Emily replied in confusion, leaning over to look at the map. Why? Harry stared at the map in growing disbelief. Then an emotion Emily had never expected to see dawned on his face: fear. She looked at the map. In a nearby corridor stood a dark label-led Bridget Doyle, and she wasn't alone. But before Emily could read the other name, Harry yanked the map away. Stay here, he ordered and took off running. Already feeling the situation was all too familiar, Emily called, Harry, wait, and ran after her brother. Harry was much faster than she was. She struggled to keep up as he shot through the corridors like an arrow. After a few seconds, she couldn't even see him anymore, only hear the echo of his footsteps. The footsteps stopped, and then from not far away, Harry shouted, Stop! Emily arrived at a wide corridor with an arched ceiling, but something was wrong. The torches were lit, but the light was black, dark. Outside the windows, there was nothing but endless darkness, even though just moments before, the night had been clear. For a split second, before the strange enchantment broke, she saw Bridget, floating upright and rigid inside what looked like enormous black cobwebs. But the vision vanished almost immediately. The darkness disappeared, and moonlight streamed through the windows. Bridget was laying motionless on the floor next to her book bag, clutching something shiny in her hand. Harry ran to her and rolled her onto her back. Emily hurried over, peering at her over Harry's shoulder. Bridget blinked in confusion, her eyes gradually focusing on Harry and Emily. She flinched and shrank away from Harry, crawling backwards across the floor as if he were some kind of monster. A genuine expression of terror was etched on her face. Bridget, what happened? Emily asked worriedly. Don't touch me, Bridget shrieked as Harry tried to help her up, crawling away from him. He was really here, Harry asked her, his tone urgent. Did you see him? Emily didn't understand what he meant, and apparently neither did Bridget, because she continued to stare at him in horror, trying to put as much distance between herself and him as possible. Emily moved towards her in concern, but Bridget shoved her away too. Stay away from me, she screamed hysterically. You're monsters, both of you are monsters. Emily drew back, hurt and confused. What had she done to Bridget to make her say something like that? Bridget's shrieks had drawn the attention of Professors Flitwick and Snape. Bridget clung to the hem of her tiny head of house's robes with shaking hands. "Miss Doyle, what happened here?" the charms teacher asked gently. "It was him," Bridget cried, pointing at Harry with a trembling finger. "He did it." "I don't understand, dear," Flitwick said kindly. But Harry seemed to have already worked it out, because his face took on a look of cold, reined-in fury. "He attacked me," Bridget said, then pointed at Emily. "And she's the one who attacked Cho. She was coming from her direction yesterday. I saw her. And tonight they attacked me so I wouldn't tell their secret." A sick feeling coiled in Emily's stomach. She looked at Bridget pleadingly. How could she say something like that? But Bridget looked at her like she didn't even know her. "It's not true, Professor," Harry said firmly to Flitwick. "I saw the attacker. It was." "Best we clarify this in the headmaster's office," Professor Snape said sharply, as if he knew what Harry was about to say. "Can you walk?" he asked Bridget. Bridget nodded quickly. She snatched her bag and was clutching it to her chest as she leaned on Professor Flitwick to stand. The strange group began to walk, Bridget still casting nervous glances back at Harry and Emily over her shoulder. Emily tried to catch her eye, but Bridget pointedly looked away. They reached the statue guarding Dumbledore's office, the same one Emily had visited at the start of the summer. "Birdie Barts," Flitwick chirped. The statue moved aside, revealing the spiral staircase that led to the headmaster's office. As she climbed, Emily was sure Dumbledore would be able to sort out the misunderstanding between Harry and Bridget. But the moment Flitwick knocked on the door and they were granted entry, she realized it wasn't going to be that simple. Inside were Dumbledore and McGonagall, in the company of the last person Emily wanted to see at that moment, Umbridge. "What's this now?" the toad-faced woman asked sweetly, surveying the group before fixing her gaze on Harry. Emily felt her brother clench his fist around his wand. Professor Snape began calmly. "It appears there's been another attack." "It was him," Bridget burst out, pointing at Harry. "He's a dark wizard, just like everyone says. And his sister, too. She's the one who attacked Cho yesterday." A terrible realization dawned on Emily. Was that why Bridget had been avoiding her all day? She thought Emily was trying to hurt her. "I never touched her, Professor. And Emily didn't do anything either," Harry said firmly, looking at Dumbledore, but the headmaster turned to gaze out the window. "If we hadn't got there when we did, she would have ended up like Cho. We saved her." Umbridge let out a strange, tinkly laugh. Harry stopped and stared at her. "What's so funny?" he asked bluntly. "Oh, nothing," Umbridge said airily. "I just find it amusing how you always seem to show up just in time to rescue the victim. You really are extraordinarily lucky." Harry chose to ignore her, turning again to Dumbledore, who still had his back to them. "Sir, I saw the attacker. It was Voldemort." Bridget gave a little moan of distress. Umbridge's fleshy jaw clenched in shock and fury, her eyes bulging dangerously. McGonagall glanced uncertainly at Dumbledore, but he remained silent with his back turned. Snape was the one who said, "I find that hard to believe." Harry turned to him sharply. Then he looked at Emily. "You were there too," he said to her. "You must have seen him. Tell them." Now everyone was looking at Emily. She felt horribly uncomfortable, especially under Harry's demanding stare. Something strange had certainly happened there, and she knew Harry hadn't caused it, but she hadn't seen anyone but him and Bridget. "I'm sorry," she stammered, not meeting Harry's gaze. It was all dark and frozen like time had stopped, and there was a shadow like giant spider webs, but there wasn't anyone else. "I'm sorry." Harry looked away from her. He said nothing, but Emily could feel the sting of betrayal radiating from him like an oppressive heat from a furnace. "Never apologize for the truth," Professor Snape said above her. "Another strange incident no one can verify," Umbridge said, tightening her cloak as if preparing to leave. "Yes, I most certainly see a recurring pattern here." Well then, Dumbledore, in light of recent events, it seems the Ministry of Magic has no choice but to take control of what is happening at the school. We shall be seeing each other very soon. Good night. With a sickly, sweet smile, she swept out of the office. A tense silence fell in her wake. Even the usually chatty portraits were quiet, waiting for Dumbledore to speak. But the headmaster was wholly absorbed in stroking the head of his phoenix. Harry made an impatient noise. "Thanks for nothing," he said to Emily in an icy voice, and walked out of the office. Chapter 29. Shadow on the Wall. "I think she's finally alone," Ron whispered, peering through the infirmary keyhole. "Blimey, I didn't know anyone could have that many friends." Harry ran a hand through his hair tensely, then instantly regretted it. Now it stuck up in every direction. "You'll be fine," Hermione told him, trying to smooth it down a little. "I don't see why you're so nervous," Ron said bluntly. "You're only going to ask her who attacked her. What's so scary about that?" "Oh, Ron," Hermione muttered despairingly. To Harry, she said more gently, "Good luck. Just be yourself." Harry wasn't sure that was a good idea, but he nodded anyway. He mustered his courage and stepped into the hospital wing. Cho was sitting in one of the beds, surrounded by mountains of bouquets, cards, and gifts. The midday light was so bright it threw the sharp contrast of her pale skin against her black hair into stark relief. She looked almost like a ghost. She was the only one there besides Bridget. Harry was glad screens had been set up around the younger girl's bed. He hoped she'd stay in the hospital wing forever. Then she wouldn't have a chance to get out and spread more ridiculous rumors about him and Emily. Him, a dark wizard. There really was no limit to what people would make up about him. "Hi, Harry," Cho said, with a half-forced smile as he approached her bed. "It's nice of you to come and visit me." Harry tried to smile back. A faint ache tugged at his heart as he looked at her. Once she'd seemed like the perfect girl to him. Now there was no beauty left in her, only grief. "How are you feeling?" he asked, just to break the ice. Harry rocked nervously on his heels. He'd been planning what to say to her all day, but now he couldn't seem to put the words in the right order. "Why don't you sit down?" Cho offered kindly. Harry dropped sharply into the nearest chair. "Cho, I wanted to ask you." Yes, was he imagining it, or was there a flicker of hope in her voice? "I wanted to ask if you remember who attacked you." A flash of disappointment crossed Cho's face. "I already told Professor Dumbledore. I didn't see his face," she said coolly. "Are you sure?" Harry couldn't be certain, but there was something in her tone that made him feel like there was something else he was supposed to catch from her tone. Why did girls have to be so complicated? "Yes," she replied, with a trace of irritation. "What were you doing there anyway?" Harry asked. "Oh, so now you're asking questions," she burst out suddenly, looking angry. "What do you mean?" Harry asked, bewildered. "I thought you cared about me," Cho said, tears springing to her eyes faster than Harry had ever seen before. "You know, I would have gone to the Yule Ball with you if not for Cedric," she gave a little sob. "And you didn't even ask how I was afterwards. You didn't care how I was after what happened. Nobody understands. But I thought you would. You were there." A heavy weight sank in Harry's stomach. He should have known this would somehow be about Cedric. He began, though he had no idea what to say. "I saw him, you know," she interrupted suddenly. "That night, that's why I was there." "You saw Cedric's ghost," Harry tried to understand. "He wasn't a ghost." Cho's voice rose, tears still running down her cheeks. A noise from Madame Pomfrey's office made it clear Harry's time there was running out. "Do you think I don't know what a ghost looks like? He was real. I felt it. He spoke to me." "Miss Chang, what's the matter?" Madame Pomfrey hurried over. "Where does it hurt, child?" Cho's crying escalated into heart-wrenching sobs. Harry felt a wave of relief when Madame Pomfrey ordered him out. He didn't need telling twice. "What did she say?" Hermione asked as he slipped out of the hospital wing. Harry took a breath to steady himself, and told them what Cho had said, leaving out the part where she'd been upset that he hadn't asked after her following the graveyard. In his humble opinion, she should have been the one asking after him, considering he'd seen a schoolmate murdered right before his eyes and had almost been killed himself. I wouldn't rule out the possibility she imagined it, Hermione said as they made their way to History of Magic. Other students passed by on their way to class without paying them any attention, and Harry knew he ought to enjoy that while he could. She's taken Cedric's death very hard. She's been crying in the toilets every day since term started, and I've heard she's on the verge of being kicked off the Ravenclaw Quidditch team because she can't fly properly. So you're saying I'm imagining things as well? Harry asked, a note of accusation in his voice. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that he'd seen Voldemort the night before. He looked as he had in the Chamber of Secrets in second year, human rather than snake-like. Only this time he looked older and kind of shaky, like he was made out of black smoke. And he had seen the name clear as day on the map, Tom Riddle. But the fact that no one else had seen him was starting to make him doubt himself. "That's not what I'm saying," Hermione replied calmly. "Unlike Cedric, you know who is still alive. Besides, it wouldn't be the first time he's appeared at Hogwarts in a different form." "Right, the Chamber of Secrets," Ron said. "Do you think it's happening again? There were attacks then as well." "I don't think so. I haven't heard a basilisk slithering about anywhere," Harry said heavily. "But maybe it doesn't have to be connected to the chamber. Voldemort's spirit was tied to that diary Ginny wrote in, right? What if there's another one, maybe with Cho or that Bridget girl, making them see and do things?" "It's possible," Hermione said thoughtfully. "Altaf, we can't rule out the possibility that there were two different attackers." "Why would you say that?" "Think about it. It's true that Cho and Bridget were attacked night after night, but the attacks themselves were completely different. Cho was hit by some kind of paralyzing spell, which is completely explainable, and it works well with the theory that someone from the Ministry was going around Professor Potter's office. On the other hand, the thing that happened to Bridget, she can't even say what happened to her. And she wasn't actually harmed at all," Harry added, realizing that Hermione had a point. "They only keep her in the infirmary because she's scared out of her mind." "We need to know more about what caused her to think you attacked her," Hermione said with determination. "We need to talk to Ginny. She might have some insight." Ron made a doubtful noise. "I'm not sure that's such a great idea." "Why not?" "Look, she doesn't like talking about what happened. After it was over, she'd go spare any time someone brought it up. That was the summer she learned the Bat Bogey Hex. Trust me, you don't want to be on the wrong end of that. But she could help us understand what's happening, maybe even stop it from happening again," Hermione insisted. "I know she'd want to catch whoever's behind it before more people get hurt." Ron shrugged. "Do what you like, but I'm not asking her." Hermione made a sound of impatience and rolled her eyes at him. History of Magic was always dull, but that day Harry wouldn't have noticed even if a troll had walked in. He couldn't stop thinking about what Cho had said. It wasn't that he thought she was right. She could have spoken to him after the graveyard too, but had chosen to ignore him. Still, it made him think about what he and Ginny had gone through in the Chamber of Secrets. If Cedric had survived that night, Harry knew they'd have become friends, or at least something close to it. After all, they'd both witnessed Voldemort's return. But he and Ginny had shared something almost as terrible, and they'd never become friends. They hadn't even spoken about it until that summer, which made him feel a little guilty. He was sure Ginny could have done with a friend who understood. "I think you should talk to her," Hermione whispered to him behind her book, as though reading his thoughts. "You were in the chamber, too. I'm sure she'll agree to speak to you." "You're right," Harry said, and for some reason his stomach gave a lurch, the way it used to when he saw Cho. "I'll find her after class." "On your snot be it," Ron muttered darkly. The upcoming conversation with Ginny made Harry more nervous than it should have, and he had a feeling it wasn't due to fear of the Bat Bogey Hex. It reminded him of how he had tried desperately to catch Cho alone to ask her to the Yule Ball last year, a task that had been nearly impossible, as she was always surrounded by a gaggle of girls. Ginny, too, always seemed to be in the company of her many friends, and Harry didn't fancy approaching her in front of them all. That was why he felt a wave of relief when, on the way to dinner with Ron and Hermione, he spotted Ginny walking down the hall, chatting with Luna Lovegood. "There's Ginny," he said to his friends, finding it oddly hard to breathe. "I'll see you in the Great Hall." "All right," said Ron in a tone that said, "Just don't say I didn't warn you," and kept walking. Hermione gave Harry a look that made him think she knew exactly what was going through his head, then followed Ron. Harry took a deep breath and started towards Ginny and Luna. "Oh, hello, Harry," Luna said kindly when he caught up with them. Ginny turned her head to look at him. Something fluttered in his stomach. "Hey," he replied, making a supreme effort to act normal. "How's it going, Luna?" "Well," said Luna cheerfully. Harry didn't know her very well, but still counted her as a friend. He would never forget how she had harbored him in her home that summer, even though he'd been a complete stranger. "We were just going to see my dad. You should come, too. I'm sure he'll be glad to see you." "Mr. Lovegood is here?" Harry asked, walking besides Luna and Ginny. "He is. He got inside information that something odd happened in the castle last night, so he's here to write a piece about it." That was not what Harry had expected to hear. His shock must have been visible because Ginny asked, "What do you know about it, Harry?" "Nothing," he lied immediately. "I also heard that something happened. Listen, Ginny, can we talk? Alone?" "Sure," Ginny said, obviously not buying his lie. "Right after we see Mr. Lovegood." Deciding it might be helpful to find out what Mr. Lovegood knows, Harry followed Ginny and Luna. "Would you like to join us next weekend for Crumplehorn's Snorkack hunting?" Luna asked him as they walked. What hunting?" Harry asked, sure he hadn't heard her right. "Crumplehorn's Snorkack," Luna repeated, as if it weren't a bizarre thing to say. "They're on their winter migration, and there have been reports of a big herd on the edge of the forest. Ginny and I are going to have a look next Saturday with my dad. You should come too. The sighting of a crumplehorned snorkack brings immense luck, and you have the Quidditch match against Slytherin the day after that." Harry found himself looking at Ginny. She smiled at him and shrugged. On any other occasion, he would have found an excuse to avoid going into the forest with Luna and her dad, but knowing that Ginny was going to be there, hopefully without her boyfriend, made it sound like a lot of fun. "Sure," he replied, without making any attempt to understand what on earth a crumplehorned snorkack even was. They met Mr. Lovegood in a fifth-floor corridor, far from the students on their way to dinner. He seemed to be chatting avidly with one of the portraits. The spot where he was waiting was just one corridor away from where Bridget was attacked. "Luna, love," Mr. Lovegood greeted his daughter with an embrace. "And you must be Miss Ginny Weasley. Luna has told me so much about you." He shook Ginny's hand warmly, looking at her with his one good eye. He was wearing a baggy purple robe and a matching hat with a long tassel adorned with what looked like a radish. If Ginny thought his appearance was strange, she didn't show it. After Ginny, Mr. Lovegood turned to Harry and shook his hand excitedly. "Wonderful to see you again, my dear boy. I was hoping to run into you during my visit to the school today." "Why?" Harry asked, before he realized it was rude. "I was hoping to get an exclusive interview from you for the next edition of the Quibbler," Mr. Lovegood explained. "The piece I published in August about the Ministry's cover-up of you-know-who's return was a great success, you see. I don't remember the last time I sold so many issues. People are obviously tired of the Daily Prophet's insincerity and are thirsty for the truth. What do you say, my boy?" Harry hesitated. He wanted the truth to get out, especially if there were people who wanted to hear it, but he was very uncomfortable with the idea of giving an interview. Sensing his distress, Ginny jumped in. "He'll think about it, Mr. Lovegood." Harry gave her a look of silent gratitude. "Very well," Mr. Lovegood agreed. Let us turn to the matter at hand. My friend Sir Whittle here, through his other portrait at the Leaky Cauldron, has informed me of a strange occurrence that took place in the next corridor last night. As an expert on strange and unexplained phenomena, I got permission from the headmaster to investigate the matter. Harry fought to suppress a surge of anger at the mention of Dumbledore. He wouldn't even listen to Harry's side of the story, but he sent the eccentric Mr. Lovegood to investigate. Was Harry so untrustworthy that even Mr. Lovegood was more reliable than him? Now, Sir Whittle, please tell us again what happened. Sir Whittle was a portrait of a man dressed in Baroque attire, with a wide cap on his balding head, whom Mr. Lovegood was speaking to before. I saw a girl running past, Sir Whittle told them excitedly, as if it was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in years. Usually, I wouldn't have given her any mind. Students run around here all the time. But the thing that drew my attention was that she was wearing a tiara. Even I know that tiaras have been out of style for centuries. She ran into the next corridor over there, and her footsteps stopped. Then she started to scream, so I immediately spread the word so someone from the school staff could come and help. I couldn't see what was happening in the next corridor, but I knew something was very wrong. I could see shadows reflecting on the floor, and they looked like hands or tentacles. That was an event of dark magic if I ever saw one. That description of events was very similar to what Harry had witnessed, except he didn't see a tiara anywhere, and of course, the portrait didn't see Voldemort. He probably made some sound or movement that revealed his thoughts, because Ginny suddenly gave him an inquisitive look. If she wasn't suspicious of him before, she was now. "Thank you for your testimony, Sir Whittle," said Mr. Lovegood, who was commanding an enchanted quill that wrote down the story on a floating piece of parchment. "Now, let us investigate the scene." Ginny walked with Luna after Mr. Lovegood, and Harry followed behind. A moment ago he had felt very uncomfortable under Ginny's gaze, but now he wished she would go back to looking at him instead of chatting with Luna. The corridor where the attack happened was like any other corridor at the castle, with the possible exception that there were no portraits there. The only decorations were a few suits of armor and a large mirror in a silver frame. Mr. Lovegood searched his many pockets until he found a device shaped like an hourglass, filled with pearly liquid. "Dark magic detector," he explained to the fascinated Ginny and Luna. "The liquid will turn black when it detects any residues of dark magic." Harry wasn't that impressed with the device, as he had learned that dark detectors could be fooled. He separated from the rest and inspected the area for any explanations for the events of the previous evening, anything that could explain Voldemort's appearance there, but there was nothing at all. He wished Ron and Hermione were there. They would surely have seen something he had missed. He examined the mirror. There was something very familiar about it, probably because he had seen it dozens of times as he passed that corridor during his years at Hogwarts. His reflection looked odd, foreign. Had he really changed that much during the summer? He looked much older. He looked like someone else, like. He jumped when something touched his arm. It was Ginny. "You all right?" she asked with amusement, but she also looked a little worried. "Haven't you ever seen your own reflection before?" Harry chuckled in embarrassment. It really was strange for him to stare into the mirror like that. There was nothing special about it now. It just showed him and Ginny standing side by side, just as they were. A heavy, awkward silence settled over them. Luna and her father were still fiddling with the dark detector at the other end of the corridor, out of earshot. Suddenly, Harry had no idea what he had been thinking when he joined this weird adventure. Every time he imagined he might be able to act normal around Ginny, he just made a bigger fool of himself. Before he could think about anything clever to say, the sound of rushing footsteps were heard. A moment later, a red-faced Umbridge appeared there, accompanied by Filch. "Just what I needed," Harry mumbled under his breath. "I always suspect students who skip dinner," Filch croaked in Umbridge's ear. "They're up to no good, I know it. And look, they brought in an unauthorized visitor." There must be some misunderstanding, Mr. Lovegood said politely as the two approached. I have explicit permission from the headmaster. I am the High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, and I did not grant my permission, Umbridge said condescendingly. Then her bulging eyes fell on Harry. The culprit always returns to the scene of the crime, does he not? Harry's hand tightened around the strap of his book bag. He felt Ginny eyeing him curiously. Allow me to introduce myself, Mr. Lovegood said, and glided towards Umbridge with his hand outstretched. The difference between his tall and wiry figure and Umbridge's short and fat form was comic. I know who you are, Umbridge said coldly. Xenophilius Lovegood, editor and owner of the ridiculous tabloid The Quibbler. If only being mad and stupid was a crime, I would have made sure you spent the rest of your life in Azkaban. Mr. Lovegood was struck speechless by this comment. Don't talk to him like that, Ginny came to his defense. What's he ever done to you, anyway? Umbridge's, I now fixated on Ginny in malice. Your name, dear? She asked in that same dangerous, dripping sweetness she used to mask her intentions. Ginny Weasley. You have quite a mouth on you, Miss Weasley. If I had the authority to do so, I would teach you how to keep it shut. But if you must know, Mr. Lovegood is printing scandalous lies about the Ministry of Magic in his tabloid. Harry was about to interject on Ginny's behalf, but she was quicker. Not having any authority never bothered you before, she said acidly, obviously referring to the time she tried to alter Harry's memories. I hope Mr. Lovegood writes about how you tried to change Harry's memories. Silence, Umbridge screeched, and with a short stroke of her wand, Ginny was rendered mute. And as for you, Mr. Lovegood, I demand you leave at once. I don't want to cause any trouble, Mr. Lovegood said at once. He said a quick goodbye to Luna and let Filch and Umbridge escort him out, as if they thought he was going to run away or steal something. The moment Umbridge turned the corner, the silencing charm on Ginny was removed, and she started shouting profanities. Umbridge must have been already out of earshot at that point. Aren't you worried about getting into trouble? Luna inquired. If she was shocked by Ginny's foul language, she hid it well. I don't care. Didn't you hear what she said to your dad? We're used to people being mean to us, Luna replied with a shrug. Dad says it's because they're afraid of what's different. Well, I hope that if he doesn't have enough to write about the incident, he'll at least write about how Umbridge stopped him from reporting on it, Ginny said, then turned to Harry. I should be known you had something to do with it. I didn't, Harry replied defensively. Right, Ginny said, and he knew she wasn't going to let it go easily. So what did you want to talk about before? Harry opened his mouth. He'd been rehearsing what to say to her all through history of magic, but no words came out. How could he just come out and tell her that maybe, not certain, but possibly, what she'd gone through 3 years ago might be happening again? He couldn't say something like that, not when he didn't know for sure. He couldn't place that burden on her. You know what, it doesn't matter, he said at last. Not waiting for her to reply, he walked away quickly. He heard her calling after him, but pretended not to hear. He was utterly alone, wandering the darkening corridors with no particular direction. Everyone else was still at dinner. What was he supposed to do? How could he go about his daily life in Hogwarts, knowing that Voldemort is able to walk the corridors undisturbed? And soon the whole school will know about what happened, and it will be like second year all over again. He wished someone could give him some advice at that moment, but he couldn't tell anyone except Ron and Hermione what had happened. He hated worrying his mum, and he shied away from talking to his dad. He couldn't talk to Dumbledore either. The headmaster had made it clear at the start of the summer that he wanted no contact with him. He ignored Harry whenever they were in the same room, even when Harry spoke directly to him. It seemed he was left alone with his questions once again, and once again he would have to find the answers by himself. If only there were someone. But there was someone. His parents might be here now, but he still had Sirius. It wasn't a perfect solution, Sirius would probably want to tell Lily and James what everything Harry was going to tell him, but perhaps he could help Harry make sense of things, make it all seem a bit less terrible. But how could he speak to him? A letter would take too long, and to use the fire in the common room he'd have to wait until night. But he didn't want to wait. He glanced out of the window, searching for a solution, and saw Hagrid's hut standing alone at the edge of the forest. Yes, that could work. Hagrid wasn't at home, but Harry was sure he wouldn't mind him using the fireplace to contact Sirius. He wasn't certain the hut was connected to the Flu network, but it was worth a try. Decision made, he hurried back to Gryffindor Tower and pulled his invisibility cloak from his trunk. Then, while everyone else was in the Great Hall, he slipped unseen past the doors and out into the autumn evening. No one noticed him as he tramped quickly over the damp grass towards Hagrid's hut, nor when he pointed his wand at the lock and muttered, "Alohomora." Inside it was dark. All the shutters were closed and the fireplace was cold. It was stuffy after months of disuse, but the familiar scent of Hagrid still lingered, wrapping Harry in a sense of security. Fang wasn't there. Hagrid must have taken him on the mission, and the place felt oddly quiet without the dogs barking and the whistle of the kettle on the stove. Harry went over to the fireplace, and after rummaging briefly among the objects on the mantelpiece, he found a small wooden box containing glittering green powder. He tossed his cloak onto Hagrid's bed, gathered some logs from the pile in the corner, and lit them in the grate. Then, as the red flames crackled, he sprinkled the Flu powder over them and said clearly, "Number 12, Grimmauld Place." The fire flared into a cool green blaze. Harry wasn't sure exactly what to do next, but assumed it couldn't be too difficult. He knelt on the floor and stuck his head into the fire. He spun sharply for a few dizzying moments before everything steadied, and he found himself looking out from within the flames into the kitchen of number 12, Grimmauld Place. "Anyone there?" he called. "Sirius, Professor Lupin." Just as he was about to give up and try again another time, footsteps sounded and Sirius appeared in the doorway. It took Harry a moment to recognize him. His hair and beard were trimmed, and he seemed to have put on a little weight. "Harry," Sirius asked in confusion, crouching down so they were level. "What are you doing? Where are you talking to me from?" "Hagrid's," Harry replied, still a bit taken aback by his godfather's changed appearance. I tried to write to you, but my mum said you were on a trip or something." "Order mission," Sirius said, glancing at the sides of the fireplace as if checking no one could eavesdrop. "That's great," Harry said, knowing how hard it had been for Sirius to be stuck in the house all summer. "What did you do?" "Nice try," Sirius replied, smiling in a way that made him look 10 years younger. "So, what are you doing here? If you're looking for James, he's out." "Actually, I wanted to talk to you," Harry said, a little embarrassed. "Me, I'm flattered," Sirius said with a wise smile. "So what's so urgent you had to break into Hagrid's hut? Need advice about girls? A little bird told me you've been spending more time lately with a certain redhead." Harry felt his face heat, even within the flames. "My dad's making stuff up." Sirius laughed. Harry thought it had been worth the risk just to see him in such a good mood. "So seriously, what happened?" Harry told him about the night before. When he got to the part where he saw Voldemort on the map, Sirius stopped him. "Voldemort was at Hogwarts." "It wasn't exactly him," Harry tried to explain. "I ran there and saw him. It was like a reflection of him when he was young. I've met him like that before." Sirius looked troubled. "And what happened then?" "He just disappeared," Harry said quickly. "Whatever he was doing to that girl stopped. She probably didn't see him, because when she came round, she thought I'd attacked her." Sirius considered this, and Harry watched him tensely. "Can the map show people who aren't actually in the castle?" he pressed his godfather. "Honestly, I don't know," Sirius admitted. "We were only a bit older than you when we made it, and we used magic we didn't fully understand." At Harry's disappointed look, he added, "But we do know the map shows ghosts, animals, and animagi." It means that a person or a being doesn't have to have a human or even physical form to appear on it. Voldemort is feared for a reason. He has dark magic at his disposal, and he's certainly not afraid to use it. Maybe he was able to use it to project himself inside Hogwarts somehow. Harry nodded. He'd hoped for a more reassuring answer. "What did Dumbledore say about it?" Sirius asked. Harry shrugged bitterly. "He acted like I didn't exist. I think he hates me." "He doesn't hate you," Sirius said, and only then did Harry realize how childish he'd sounded. "He can be an old git sometimes, but he has your best interest at heart." "Yeah," Harry said, unconvinced. His anger towards Dumbledore only grew. "I'd better go," he said, the conversation beginning to weigh on him. "All right," Sirius said in understanding. "Take care of yourself." Harry withdrew his head from the fire and found himself once more in Hagrid's hut. He rose slowly from the floor, threw the cloak over himself, and left. Hogwarts stood calm and silent in the swiftly falling twilight. The bright lights in the castle windows pierced Harry's heart like a poisoned arrow. Hogwarts was meant to be his home, but with every passing day, he felt more and more alienated from it. All the other students thought he was a liar. Dumbledore had lost what little interest he'd ever had in him, and very soon Bridget Doyle would be out of the hospital wing, ready to tell everyone he dabbled in the dark arts for fun. With a heavy heart, he returned to the Gryffindor common room. When he entered, he saw Emily sitting with her friends next to one of the far-off tables, busy with their homework. He moved away before she could notice him. He was beginning to realize he had been harsh with her before, but he also didn't feel he should apologize. He was angry with her for turning his back on him when he needed her. He drifted past groups of students, relieved when they paid him no attention, and moved towards the dormitories. But before he reached the stairs, someone grabbed his rucksack strap sharply. He turned to find himself face to face with Ginny. He'd almost forgotten about their earlier conversation, but she hadn't. "What was it about earlier?" she asked. "What was what about?" "Don't play coy. Why did Umbridge talk about returning to the scene of the crime?" Ginny confronted him. "I knew you were involved in what happened somehow. You always are." The last comment didn't sit with Harry well at all. He hated that Ginny just assumed that he was involved in anything odd that happened in the school. "Is that what you wanted to talk to me about before Umbridge came around?" Ginny asked when he didn't respond to her comment. "So what was it about?" "I told you it doesn't matter," he said, feeling his face growing warm. Ginny raised an eyebrow. He added, "It's stupid." "It mattered enough this afternoon," Ginny said stubbornly, not letting it go. What was he supposed to say? That what had happened to her 3 years ago might be happening again, pile more fears and worries onto her. "I was thinking about what we talked about," he said at last. "About needing to learn to defend ourselves. It'd be hard to set up a club like that under Umbridge's nose. But I thought, if you want to learn defensive spells, I could teach you." Ginny gave him an odd look. Suddenly, he realized his excuse was a poor one. "You know, with Ron and Hermione," he added quickly. Ginny looked a little annoyed. "You do know I'm going out with Michael." "I know that," Harry said, irritated with his own stupidity and her sharp perception. "That's not what I was getting at." Ginny didn't look convinced. Harry tightened his grip on the rucksack strap. Anger bubbled inside him, threatening to spill over. Why did it feel like no one saw him for who he really was? Why did everyone insist on twisting his actions into something warped and wrong? Cho with her demands, Dumbledore with his looks of disappointment, and now Ginny thinking he was trying to go behind her boyfriend's back, not realizing he was only trying to protect her. "See you around," he muttered, slipping quickly into the boys' dormitory before he could do or say something he'd regret.